John, I'm sorry.
That's okay.
I met so many people.
Yeah.
All at once.
Yeah. It's no problem. I'm actually back in the back doing the live stream and doing all the IT stuff.
Right. Yeah. We met
Right. Yeah.
first day.
Exactly. Yeah.
Hi, Yuki.
Good to see you. I didn't really recognize you all. Fancy now.
Hi.
You can recognize me as my
Oh, you
hairstyle.
have the hair too.
Likewise. Yeah. Don't look forward. Yeah, we'll see how it goes. You ready? Good. Woohoo! That's fun. These are soft.
I forgot my name today.
Yeah, me too. Mine's in Oliver's doghouse.
Everybody.
Well, good morning, everyone.
That helps.
Welcome to the third and final day of our 50th anniversary celebration. And let me say straight away that it may be the last day of the conference, but we are hardly finished. We have beginning tonight at 7 o'clock at the Lemley Theaters, the Common Good International Film Festival. And that's going to be continuing on for a few days. If you have questions about that, I'm happy to speak with you. And a lot of excellent films. In fact, 10 process relational films are going to be played over the next few days. So if you have interest, please join us. It's going to be an excellent event. Well, I have the privilege of introducing Dr. Gunna Young, an economist, a professor of Hanshin University in South Korea, and a research fellow of the Ecological Civilization in Korea project at the Center for Process Studies. He's on the steering committee of the 60+ Climate Action Korea, as well as chairman of the Lab 2050. Dr. Young received his PhD in Seoul National University with a major in labor economics, and has expanded his interests at the local economic level in community building, the issues of aging, circular economy, and he's currently interested in ecological transformation. He's been involved in nonprofit think tanks for over 30 years, and for the past 10 years has been actively involved in collaborative public-private partnerships with Seoul Metropolitan Government and the Office of Seoul Education in order to promote local sustainable development and the empowerment of communities. So today, Dr. Young will be moderating our session on economies and communities for the common good. Dr. Young.
Hello, good morning. This is Gunna Jung from Korea. Yeah, I'm very exceptional participants who came to this location directly from other country, far from. Yeah, I crossed the Pacific Ocean. I'm an economist, as I was introduced, and facilitating today's first session. I'm very excited to meet many colleagues and friends that I have known for many years, again, like in person. By the way, congratulations again to Professor John Kopp on his 98th birthday and 5th anniversary of the Center for Process Studies. I have to say this, for I am here representing many white-headed researchers in Korea and EcoSIP Korea members in Seoul, Korea. So now back to my role as a moderator, let me introduce the first speaker, Megan Anderson. She has a background in mathematics and theology. In 2019, she received her MA from Claremont School of Theology, studying interdisciplinary studies with a concentration in religion, society, and social change. In graduate school, Megan worked for the Institute of Ecological Civilization. Megan comes to her work as CHELP, taking an intersectional approach to everything. The title of her presentation today is A Future in Process, Energy and Economics in Service for the common good. Please welcome Megan.
I'm very short. Awesome. And
Is that correct, Megan? Her name is
perfect. Thank you so much for the introduction. As you said, I'm talking about energy, equity, and economy in service to the common good. And I wanted to start with this slide to kind of emphasize this is the state of the world that we currently live in. In California, we've seen the fires, we've seen the droughts, we've seen massive storms across the world. We've also seen people without jobs, we've seen war. Like the world itself, and I don't need to tell any of you, but the world itself is in crisis. And it's created a lot of moral crises along with it. So I've talked to a lot of people my age, a lot of young women, and there's a moral qualm about even bringing new kids into the world. It's something I think about a lot. You know, like if I bring a child in, what is the world that I'm bringing them into? What is the world that my 3-year-old niece is going to live in? And I start with this because it has everything to do with the common good and the world that we're creating. And it's really a frame, I think, for a lot of discussion and a lot of the application of the work that all of you have been doing and talking and learning about over the past few days. So the question is there common good in our common home? And I think the answer is definitely yes, but there needs to be more of it. It needs to be cultivated. It needs to be grown. It needs to extend deeper within our local communities. So as mentioned earlier, the title of my presentation is A Future in Process, Economics in Service of the Common Good. And what I'll kind of be describing is one way the organization I work with, the Community Home Energy Revolution Project, or CHIRP for short, is working to bring common good to the local communities and our nation through these 3 areas. So when I was thinking about this presentation, I was like, what does the common good look like to me? If I had to imagine the common good, this is the image that comes to mind. So it's the garden at the bay in Singapore. It includes solar, those big trees, mega trees up there, they're powered by solar. They have biomass boiler systems, they have rainwater harvesting, they have community events and programs. Like, obviously Singapore and nowhere in the world is perfect, but when you look at that, integration with nature, that feels to me like the common good, like a place where we're living in a way that is beneficial for our communities and the earth. So here, these are just a few principles that I think describe the common good. It's not exhaustive by any means, but you have knowledge and education, you have dignity in your work, you have access to green space and beauty, you're able to express yourself artistically, you have a flourishing, well-being economy, there's respect, equity, and justice at the heart of the work we do, and there's connection among our community members and access to the vital resources we need to survive and flourish. I'm going to touch on these as I go throughout my conversation. Obviously, there's more that you could add to this list. And to begin with, I want to touch a little bit on well-being economy first, because this is at the heart of a lot of what CHIRP it wants to do. So, as many of you know, our economy right now is focused on profit and GDP. How much money can we make regardless of the expense to people or the earth? And when we're talking about well-being economy, we're talking about expanding well-being and climate and restoration and focusing on not GDP, but the well-being of society. So Sometimes you'll see this in what's called the Cleveland model or circular economies. And I'll talk more about that later in the presentation in terms of how CHIRP is distributing energy and trying to rebuild our local economies through our work. So CHIRP stands for, the Community Home Energy Revolution Project, because we're trying to change the way energy is created and distributed in our societies. So the focus is on building energy equity, resiliency, economic vitality through a model that focuses on localized solar production in a nonprofit model. So we're giving back constantly to the community. So we have 4 goals. Obviously, we're working with solar, so we want to address global warming. We want to bring Black, middle-class, living wage jobs into our communities, particularly for those who have been left behind, who face barriers into the workforce, who've been underserved and neglected in many ways. We want to stimulate the local economies, help them flourish, that whole well-being economy model. And finally, we want to do everything with a focus on justice and equity. So how does CHIRP do this? First, so we've started a nonprofit solar panel assembly factory in Pomona. It's right on Holt. It's in the same area as the swap meet. If you know Pomona at all, you can come visit, come see it. And there we're going to create the most advanced solar panel currently available in the world. I don't want to spend a lot of time on technology, but I'll say the inventor, he woke up one day and he realized at one point all of his patents had been monetized overseas. So during the Great Recession, he's like, man, I was a large contributor to this process because everything is being monetized. So our jobs are leaving, our money is leaving the economy, and I want to bring it back. So when he was looking at this new solar technology that makes panels safer, it makes them more efficient, it allows us to use less rare minerals in the panels. He's like, I want to do that here. So I'm creating access and jobs and opportunity for the communities in my country that need them most. We can go into a long conversation if people have questions, but I'll leave it there. And then second, a blended nonprofit for-profit business model, often known as a social enterprise. So using the profits you make, not to become wealthy individually, but to reinvest them in your community. Once again, you're circulating dollars, you're creating a circular economy, and you're helping people that need it most. And again, adding these two together, you're maximizing the benefits for the local community. So this is a picture of our factory in Pomona. What I love to emphasize when I'm showing this slide is that there's artwork and color everywhere. So that big sun rainbow mural was painted by a local artist in Pomona. It's hard to see so far away, but there's other local art also placed around the factory. And the goal was twofold. One, earlier we talked about art and beauty in terms of well-being and the common good. We want to place that inside the factory. Community connectedness. We want the factory to feel like it's a part of the Pomona community, not something that just has come in and exists there. And secondly, when you work in a space or you speak or sit in a space that's beautiful, you feel better, you're more productive, you're happy. And that's how we want people to feel as they're working in the factory. Like, I come from Wisconsin, and we have glass factories, and they're hot, and they're dark, and they're not fun whatsoever. I clicked the wrong button by accident. Sorry, Andrew. Thank you. They're not pleasant to be inside at all. Like, you don't get up and enjoy going to work in a place that's dark and hot and feels like a gray concrete box. Coming into a space that has color and reminds you of the community you came from is a whole different story. So there's a model around what we can do with energy, and there's also a model around how factories can exist in the United States and what they can be to make life more happy for the people working there. Secondly, the way CHIRP will operate in Pomona is we are a workforce development center. So the goal in terms of producing panels is also coupled with, let's train people so they have the skills to be leaders in the green movement that we're seeking to create. So when we bring people in, 75% of our workforce will be transitional, so focusing on hard-hit populations like veterans, people with diverse abilities, at-promise youth, folks who have been involved in the justice system. Again, folks who have been often neglected, left behind, and even ostracized to some degree in society. Bring them in, train them on the various positions inside the factory, show them the career pathways that they can take afterwards, give them certifications, connect them even with like the local electric union, which provides very high quality jobs, and help them get on a path to get from where they are to a life that's sustainable and has meaning for them. And so when we designed this facility, we designed it with people in mind. So you can have a solar factory that's pretty much 100% automated. You need like 3 workers, the panels just run through. And here we've decreased automation. We've only used it where it's necessary and where it's efficient. Like when you're creating a string of cells, you don't want people soldering 40 cells together because it's unpleasant and not efficient. But where we could, we wanted to create jobs so people can work together, they can learn, and they can gain the skills they need to be successful. And that's not the typical model for solar production whatsoever. So earlier I mentioned circular economies. And I want to describe kind of how CHIRP is fitting itself into that model. So right now, the way it currently exists around energy is people pay their local utilities for their energy bills. You get a bill from, if you're from Southern California, SoCal Edison, and you pay them for your bill. But SoCal Edison is not really within the economy. So money is constantly leaking out of our economy to utility companies that don't exist or necessarily even care about our local communities. And the way we want to change that is, so Little Chirp House is our logo. The way we can bring money back in is, one, you create like a nonprofit solar module assembly factory like we have in Pomona. And then you work with the anchor institutions, like your schools, your municipal buildings, your hospitals, your libraries, and you set up agreements with them where suddenly they're purchasing your panels and they're purchasing your energy. In Pomona, we have a community choice aggregation, which means the city of Pomona and the businesses in Pomona can choose where they get their energy. If they want renewable energy or they want to buy it from a local source, they can do that. So the anchor businesses get solar, they're purchasing energy from CHIRP, and then the profits that CHIRP gets, we dump into our workforce development programs and we dump into community solar for the local community members. And so now you have energy bill offsets for low-income families who are struggling. So they have more money to use on their essential spending needs. Their school supplies, their clothing, their food, even just recreation that they deserve to do and often don't have the resources to do it for. And so you have money that's then circulating within your local economy, because when you're spending your money immediately, you're often spending it locally. So you're buying food from your local stores, you're going to your local department stores for clothing. And obviously we want to encourage people to spend with local businesses as well. And we've been working with the city of Pomona to see if there are incentives or coupons or ways we can also incentivize like hyper-local spending within the economy. And so money circles back. You have workers working in the factory, and you have local spending. And so here's, I forgot that this slide has a million different things. But this is a better picture of how the cycle works. So you have money invested in the factory invested in workers and households, you have the retail economy, and you have a circular cycle between people spending money in their economy, which is providing more jobs and more opportunity to the local population, and it just goes round and round rather than folks sending them out to a large utility that is not reinvesting whatsoever back into the local economy. So, what does this have to do with process studies? We're at the 50th anniversary of the Center for Process Studies. And I put a wave up here because I learned about process studies when I was an undergrad. It was my junior year. I was taking a course on theological explorations, and that was my first interaction with process studies is through a wave. Because process studies has to do with, here we go. It has to do with the elements of becoming and change through experienced reality. And to me, a wave is the perfect experience. You're ebbing and you're flowing, and you're learning and you're experiencing. And sometimes we have to make a big splash, and we have to disrupt the status quo. So the wave is crashing in because we're going to change, and it's going to make a big splash. And to me, Chirp's model is all about process. It was a long process just to work with the Pomona community to see if this is something that they wanted. It was a process just to prove that we could do this. There were a lot of hurdles that we faced because it's new, because it's making a splash. A lot of people were like, number one, that the technology doesn't work, so we proved it with Harvey Mudd. Number two, they're like, you can't build a factory, and we're like, here's a factory, and now our panels are getting certification this June, and we're going to show how we can train and we can upskill the workforce, and we can be an integral part of the city of Pomona. We can work with the school district, we can work with the college students. We can show how this model works to bring back community wealth and then expand that across California and across the nation. So when I think of process, the idea even of how we expand is a process. So Chirp doesn't want to own hundreds of factories across the United States. What we're doing is we're going to local nonprofits and local communities and saying, you know, like, are you interested, number one, in this? Does it fit your mission? Does it fit the goals you have? 2 minutes? Perfect, almost done. And if it does, let's make this happen. And so as we expand, we're expanding in a way that fits the community it's in. When you're working with local nonprofits, they know their communities. If Chirp just went to another city, we don't know anything. If it's in Buffalo, New York, we know nothing about their community. But when you access the anchor institutions and the community benefit organizations and other places and have them be the people who own and operate these facilities, they're going to operate in a way that benefits the people that they serve the most. And then finally, this is just a list of some of the communities that we're currently in conversation with, and there's also a number of tribes, including the Seneca Nation, and the Zuni tribe in New Mexico, and the Palo Band of Mission Indians here in San Diego. So there, you can see as we have this network, you're creating literally an energy revolution, because your local communities now have control over their energy, and they can serve their communities, they can create their jobs, and can create a new way to distribute and create energy in our communities in a way that's grounded in the common good. I'll skip this just for time's sake, but Los Angeles has a goal of 10 gigawatts of new renewable energy in the state, and that would take 30 million solar panels. And right now, because most solar panels are made overseas, all that money is going out of the economy. So if we establish a network of factories, it would take 15 to meet their goal by 2045, you're bringing all that money back, you're bringing jobs back, and you're reinvesting that money locally. So to end, this is a part of our team. If you ever want to come visit, we'd love to see you, love to give you a tour, love to talk more, but that's it.
Thank you, Megan. Yeah, energy transition is one of the big issues for the ecological transformation. So also in Korea, and now is the time when the energy prices is skyrocketed. So this might be the chance or opportunities for the renewable energy businesses based on profit or non-profit might have a great time of booming, I'm expecting. And in Seoul or in Korea too, many local governments or civic societies or co-ops are more and more interested in the issue of this type of new economic entities. So I think the energy and food and care is three areas might be wonderful areas for the alternative economic model can be easily applied and can be flourished. So thank you, Megan, again for introducing the example of, let me see. Yeah, to letting us imagine an alternative economics through the example of nonprofit company that runs a locally based renewable energy business. And also thank you for introducing the basic principle of circular economy that could be applied at the local level. So now next speaker is Dr. Andrew Schwartz. Andrew is Executive Director of the Center for Process Studies and co-founder and Executive Vice President of the Institute for Ecological Civilization. He earned his PhD in philosophy and religion and theology at Claremont Graduate School. Graduate University. His academic interests include comparative religious philosophies, process thought, ecology, education, and more. His recent work has been focused on high-impact philosophy and the role of big ideas in the transition towards ecological civilization. Today's paper is titled as More Money, More Problems, Relational Philosophy for a Well-being Economy. Please welcome Andrew.
Well, thank you, Megan, for a wonderful presentation that I think provides a great practical example of the kind of work that is already being done and the work that can be done in other places. I want to talk a little bit more about the theory behind what Megan's doing in rethinking the economy when my presentation's... Aha, there we go, okay. When I was a kid, I would often play tricks on my younger brother, pictured here. One classic example involved money. We would trade coins. I offered my nickels for his dimes. See, nickels were bigger, after all, so they must be better. At least that's what I told him. Not understanding that a dime held double the monetary value of nickels, he would agree and he would trade with enthusiasm. He's getting a good deal. So, failing to understand the abstract value of these nickels, these nickel-plated hunks of copper, my brother was ripe for exploitation. I used my superior knowledge of the world of finance. You see, I was in 3rd grade and he was only just in kindergarten, to take advantage of his ignorance for my own financial gain. I couldn't care less about the actual pieces of metal. I couldn't care about their size, their color, their physical makeup. You see, I knew that one was worth 5 cents and the other 10. Moreover, I knew that a dime could get me 10 pieces of penny candy, while a nickel would only get me 5. And since more candy was the goal, dimes were better than nickels. My childhood understanding of monetary theory was rudimentary at best, and still it captures the essence of how most of us think about money as adults. We want more money so we can get more, fill in the blank. More stuff, more power, more influence, more security. Unfortunately, more money actually leads to more problems, though perhaps not quite in the way that American rapper Biggie Smalls suggested. You see, the more fundamental problem with money is actually philosophical. It's a problem that comes with massive social and environmental consequences. There are very few systems that affect our day-to-day lives more than the economy. Governing how we acquire the basic material needs for survival, from food and water to homes and healthcare and more. Economies are central features of society. We all talk about it. It's a regular campaign concern for politicians and a focal point for voters. Yet despite its critical function in dictating the conditions for human flourishing, the economy is rarely examined publicly in a way that peels back the opaque curtains of markets and jargon to reveal core principles, values, and assumptions that underlie these systems. A growing number of young people in the United States, especially those who favor democratic socialism, big supporters of Bernie Sanders, have been quick to criticize capitalism, naming that as the big bad problem. You see, what often happens is we equate capitalism with an economic system that yields massive inequality. But what exactly is capitalism, and why is it increasingly deemed the bad guy? Strictly speaking, capitalism is just an economic system where private individuals and businesses own the means of production. Sounds harmless enough, right? No glaring oppression inherent in the theory, right? Well, that is until we peel back the layers and examine the philosophical underpinnings, the values and the worldviews that are central to this economic framework. The ultimate goal in capitalism is to maximize profits. Now, profit can be calculated by simply subtracting total expenditures from total revenue. The most common strategy then for maximizing profit involves two basic principles. You can increase your revenue and decrease your expenses. But to increase revenue, a company must increase sales. And increasing sales entails increasing human consumption, right? You need more people buying more stuff. However, the goal of capitalism is not just to increase profits, it is to maximize profits. Effectively, this means maximizing consumption. When the core strategy of the entire global economic order is to maximize consumption, environmental degradation follows. As demonstrated by the famous 1972 report, The Limits of Growth, such a system is wholly unsustainable. The economy doesn't take place in a vacuum. Like any living system, the Earth has limits, but these limits aren't taken into account within an economic system that professes a single bottom line: profit at any cost. Even more socially conscious businesses that have recently adopted a relatively new triple bottom line, people, planet, and profit, Well, it's kind of unclear which of the three P's takes priority when push comes to shove. So often the traditional bottom line, that of profit, ends up being the default value. The second method for maximizing profit is to minimize expenses, or more accurately, it's to maximize the gap between input and output. So for most companies, the biggest expense is actually workers, us. So to maximize profits of a company is in order to do that, you have to search for that perfect balance between the lowest possible input, so the lowest number of workers, the lowest possible wages, and so on, that are needed to yield the greatest possible output. In other words, the guidelines for good business is to get more and give less. So naturally, the exploitation of workers becomes standard practice for businesses that are following this prime directive to maximize profit. And since in a capitalist system, businesses are privately owned, even when publicly traded, the maximization of profits through the exploitation of workers actually means increasing the wealth of the individuals that own these companies. In short, capitalism with the singular goal of maximizing profit results in a world where 8 individuals can own as much wealth as half of the global population combined. As a result, the exploitation of people and the planet for the sake of power and profit is actually standard procedure within a capitalist framework. This isn't simply because business owners are greedy and evil people, though we can't rule that possibility out completely. The problem, I contend, is actually the underlying framework. Here I mean the core assumptions, the values, the beliefs, the goals upon which capitalism is built, because it sets our economy in the wrong direction. As former Harvard business professor turned major critic of corporate rule, David Korten explains, it is literal, in its literal meaning, capitalism means rule by capital. More specifically, ruled by the owners of the capital for their exclusive private benefit, or simply rule by money. This capitalism is grounded in an elitist ideology of individualism supported by an institutional system devoted to the concentration and abuse of wealth for the exclusive benefit of a private ruling oligarchy. It is capitalism that claims to champion democracy and markets even as it destroys them. The capitalism that claims to bring universal prosperity even while denying it to all but its most favored servants. This capitalism that destroys life to make money and organizes as a suicide economy that destroys the foundations of its own existence and ours. In short, more money, more problems. But as our collective obsession with money is actually not inherent in the theory of capital as such. Economist Mark Anielski explains that there's actually 5 types of capital, and money is only one of them. We've got human capital, which includes things like individual minds, bodies, spirits, and their capabilities. Social capital, including the quality and strength of our relations and community. Things like trust and honesty, common values, and including tolerance. There's natural capital, stocks and funds of things in nature that yield flows of natural resources and life-supporting ecosystem services. There's also built capital, machines, tools, durable consumer goods. And then finally, financial capital, so money and other liquid assets that are used for payment of transactions and debts. Unfortunately, the exclusive interest in money has meant that the other forms of capital are largely ignored, or worse, considered only as means to the end of more money. While it has become the dominant mode of economics existence, a historic turning point in the rise of capitalism is often traced back to the 18th century philosopher Adam Smith. Smith is best known for his work, we call it The Wealth of Nations, which is widely considered a foundation for the creation of economics as an academic discipline. I won't get into that problem, but John Cobb has, and a framework for the form of capitalism that's affiliated with economic liberalism. Smith was a friend and an interlocutor of David Hume, who's actually featured here at this very sanctuary outside by this statue shown here. Smith was also a major influence in the Scottish Enlightenment. But like most philosophers in his era, Smith seemed to have taken for granted a substance narrative as a means for explaining continuity and identity amidst an ever-changing world. A core feature of his moral philosophy and his economic theory was the belief that humans are rational and self-interested individuals. He writes, "It is not from," this is my, Adam Smith accent, right? "It is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own self-interest. We address ourselves not to their humanity, but to their self-love, and never talk to them out of our own necessities, but of their advantages." I mean, this is the mindset at the very core of our economic model. Effectively, such statements are an appeal to create an economic system that has positive feedback loops, right? So that means that individuals contribute to the needs of others because they're indirectly receiving something beneficial in return. Actually, it's the opposite. They're pursuing their own self-interest and then accidentally create benefit for others. Smith believed in a free market economy, an economy without government regulations, with an invisible hand shown here that will guide and control the flow of production and consumption. Whereas government regulation is a thoroughly visible hand of control, Smith identifies a hand that's unseen. It's behind the scenes. It's existing as an unintended consequence. In short, he believed that the needs of the many, the consumers, would be taken care of by incentivizing individuals, producers, who are only self-interested. Now, some theorists have criticized Smith, arguing that a laissez-faire capitalism results in a radical concentration of wealth by where the 1% wealthiest individuals can pursue their self-interest at the expense of the 99%. Some of you may resonate with that. Others defend Smith, arguing that a truly free economy has never actually been tested because governments have always intervened. These arguments tend to focus on whether or not self-interest alone is sufficient to provide for the needs of the whole. I want to take a different approach. I actually want to challenge the capitalist notion of an individual. See, at its core, capitalism prioritizes the individual. By contrast, socialism prioritizes the collective. And herein lies the appeal of both frameworks. There is something about the focus on the individual, so my needs, my interests, my gifts, my desires, and my goals, that speaks to something important in human experience. Likewise, there's something about the focus on community that speaks to something important as well. After all, none of us are an island. In this way, capitalism and socialism both represent a socio-economic expression of distinct answers to an age-old philosophical dilemma, the problem of the one and the many. So what is the world like? We might begin to answer this by reflecting on our own experience. And in doing so, I think two things become immediately clear. I experience multiplicity, and I experience multiplicity. You see, reality consists of both one and many, both unity and diversity, identity and difference. Extremes that embrace one to the exclusion of the many, or embrace the many to the exclusion of the one, are not only insufficient descriptions of reality, but actually destructive paradigms that undermine the web of life. Beneath the political and economic structures that govern so much of our lives are philosophical assumptions about what the world is like and what it means to be human. A substance-based metaphysic that considers the final real things upon which the world is made to be individual, independent, enduring substances will inevitably result in a competitive paradigm that puts individuals' identities at odds with community. But is another way possible? I think so. According to classical substance ontology, an individual is both independent and enduring. But we process thinkers, vis-a-vis Alfred North Whitehead, affirm a different perspective. oops, I went too far. Can you go back? Sorry. Process philosopher David Ray Griffin explains Whitehead's worldview, stating, "For Whitehead, however, the most fully actual things are not enduring individuals, but momentary events that he calls actual occasions or occasions of experience. These occasions have a more or less brief existence, lasting anywhere from less than a billionth of a second in the case of electronic and photonic occasions to perhaps a tenth of a second in the case of the occasions of human experience. This doctrine means that the things that endure, such as electrons, molecules, and minds, already exemplify a type of social existence. Whitehead accordingly calls them societies. Enduring individuals are temporarily ordered societies. The social relations are then purely temporal, because only one member exists at a time. Griffin continues, any given occasion of experience belongs to that temporal society that consists of all those members that came before and all that will come after it. And this doctrine makes social relations fundamental while making enduring substances derivative." So does this mean that there's no I in individual? Does it mean that a person is not an individual? Without any concept of an enduring identity, do all distinctions fade away, such that I am indistinguishable from you? If so, does that mean that when I married my wife, I actually married myself? Okay, so before you have an existential crisis, I think it would be helpful if we clear up some confusion by distinguishing between the technical meaning of individual, according to Whitehead, and the normal everyday use of the term. You see, insofar as I experience reality as a distinct subject, I'm the unique center of an experience, then we can understand ourselves to be individuals in the normal sense. But we must not stop there, as doing so runs the risk of defaulting back to a substance ontology of the independent individual being. As Whitehead argues, the real, actual things that endure are all societies. They are not actual occasions. It's a mistake to confuse societies with the complete, real things, which are the actual occasions. So, in a technical sense, an individual is a momentary center of values felt, an impermanent existence of subjectivity at the instance when what is possible becomes actual. It's what Whitehead refers to as a moment of concrescence. Of course, that's not how we use the term individual in normal, everyday use in society, because the dominance of substance ontology, an individual is typically thought to be distinguishable as an entity with enduring identity. Upon further reflection, it seems that actually what we mean by the term individual in everyday use, and particularly when in an economic context, what we mean by the individual is a person. But what is a person? Whitehead expert John B. Cobb Jr. puts it this way: an occasion of human experience is not to be understood as a person experiencing. There is no person beneath or behind the experience. The act of taking the past into account and constituting itself with the view of the future is the actual occasion. The person is constituted as a long series of such occasions, growing out of one another and out of the body. You see, in that sense, what is normally called an individual, a person, is actually what Whitehead calls a society. But this is more than mere wordplay. It involves a fundamental shift in narrative, a radically different understanding of what it means to be human. And as such, Whitehead's ontology, I think, can inform a new economic paradigm that reimagines the consumer as a society. So does that mean that process philosophies predisposed capitalism or socialism? Well, in a sense, neither. Both capitalism and socialism, popularly expressed, actually adopt this modern understanding of the individual as independent and enduring. But that's not what we want to propose. So John Cobb and Herman Daly have a wonderful book that explain an alternative view of the economy from largely a process relational perspective. It's a very thick book with great examples of what this could look like in practice. So if you haven't read it, I encourage you to do so. I want to conclude by saying this. one of the examples that Cobb and Daly go when they talk about a future, a well-being economy, has to do with changing what we measure. And as this chart shows, when we're measuring gross domestic product, GDP, as Megan mentioned, not to be confused with ChatGPT, it's actually just measuring the flow of money. But the flow of money doesn't consider all these other things like the well-being of people, the well-being of the planet, and in fact, they tend to be at odds. The more money we have, the faster we destroy the very planet that we're living on. More money, more problems. So I hope that a process relational worldview can actually contribute to the urgent task of transitioning from, as David Corton says, making a killing on a dying earth to making a living on a living earth. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. Yeah, as an economist, it is very interesting, and I have a lot to say, but I have to refrain here now. But one thing I'd like to remember, his presentation reminds me of the book I read in 1970. That book was published in 1970s, but Czechoslovakian political philosopher, and he wrote a book about the dialectics of concrete. And also, now I interpret his idea as the fallacy of misplaced concrete. Really, and we studied, as a grade student, we totally agree with the viewpoint. And also Marx said that capital is different from the money, because money, everything, every entity or subject can be capital or not, when the issue is the relationship, the relation. So money is put in the relation with labor in the process of production. It can be a capital. So man, it could be a capital, or the machine could be a capital. Money could be a capital. If we put money in the underground or the garage, it's not capital. It's very relational thinking, I believe. And also, I have to say later in the discussion session, though, but one thing I'd like to put before I forget is that Andrew put the market and the plan-based socialism or capitalism. But I think the real socialist societies might be very different from what Marx said or wrote in his many books. So I reinterpret Marx as he is imagining the communities of communities. And also he wants to expand the relationship of production at the company level, at the corporate level, towards the society. Planning, every company plans, and hierarchies and command. That's the core of the company or corporations. It's different from market. So he wants to make the original basic idea of the corporation, put aside the ownership to make it social and to expand the system of decision-making at the societal level. That's the socialism what he imagined. I think I have to stop here. And yeah, thank you again, Andrew. And the next, our last speaker is Dr. Dong Lee. Dr. Lee is a director of the Korean project at the Center for Process Studies. He is also an executive director of Ecology Korea. And he earned his PhD degree in religious studies, comparative theology and philosophy at Claremont School of Theology, 2022. And his dissertation is organic panentheism in Northeast Asian views. Dr. Lee's major areas of expertise are comparative religion and philosophy, process thought, post-colonialism, post-constructualism, and contextual studies. Lately, he wrote a book titled Imagining Post-Pandemic Meta-Church, which was published in South Korea. He's going to present a paper titled The Concept of the Common Good in a Theological Perspective. Please welcome Dr. Lee.
Thank you, Dr. Gonajong. It will come up, okay. So let me talk about the concept of common good from perspective of John Cobb's organic philosophy and Byung-Moo Ah's Minjung theology. So Pakistan has been hit hard by record-breaking heavy rains across the country. The torrential rainfall began June 2022 and continued until the end of August. Heavy rains caused by climate change has displaced more than 30 million people and claimed the lives of over 1,000 people as of August 27, 2022. Experts view the heavy rain as an extreme weather phenomenon caused by the climate change. The torrential rain is estimated to have caused $13 billion in damage, and it will take more than 5 years to rebuild after the destruction. This is an unprecedented level of damage. However, it is hard to see the people who are invisible behind such staggering figures. How much did local Pakistani family who used to be corn farmers contribute to climate change? Is the pain they are experiencing justified? How fair and honest can you be in answering these questions? Those who are suffering from climate change are once again alienated by the social and economic structural evil that discriminate against and oppress them. The poorer the country, the less its ability to cope with and overcome the effects of the climate crisis. The current worldwide environmental predicament is closely interlinked with the prevailing global economic disparity framework that bifurcates the global into the global north and south. So this inequality is ingrained in the ideology of colonialism, which perpetuate the roots of servitude and racialized disharmony. Every 6 to 7 years, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, presents scientific data analysis and feasible options in the form of scenarios for coping with the climate change. Scientific observation and data over the past 30 years, especially the recent scientific data in IPCC's report, supports the fact that human civilization is the main cause of the global warming that is causing the climate crisis. Many scientists at IPCC argue that dramatic action must be taken so that the rise of the Earth's temperature does not exceed 1.5 Celsius degree. This is considered a critical point at which the Earth can maintain the balance of the ecosystem without losing its resilience. Unfortunately, there is a very high possibility that in near future, our civilization will exceed the critical point in terms of global warming. This fact presents us with a very gloomy future. A temperature increase of more than 2 degrees will lead to the widespread and irreversible climate crisis. And we cannot fully predict its effect. Ecosystems of the Earth will face a major crisis, and human survival will be threatened. What we must not forget in this future, projections is that much of the damage caused by the climate crisis will be experienced by third world countries and by the poor of the countries. The climate crisis may seem to affect everyone equally, but the extent to which the direct damage affects actual life varies according to social and economic conditions. It is not difficult to predict that the climate crisis will produce an unimaginably high number of climate refugees and climate displaced people. Those are the people that are at the center of my presentation. Cobb calls them a new community, and Minjung theologian Byung-Woo An called them Minjung. The original concept of Minjung was defined in the context of South Korea of the 1970s. At that time, the general populace who were being oppressed and persecuted by the Yushin military dictatorship and the push for economic firstism were victims of structural contradictions in Korean society. The gospel of Jesus that proclaimed freedom to the little ones in oppressed and marginalized societies led South Korean theologians in the 1970s to come up with the notion of the people, also called the Minjung. As a victim of the Roman imperialism, the Jesus movement, which shared the gospel of the kingdom of God with the ordinary people who were oppressed and marginalized by religious and political elites, offered new insights to Koreans in the 1970s. Christianity, which was born in the Jesus movement, was recognized as different from a religion that met the needs and desires of the elites of the society. Instead, it was a religion of the oppressed, and Jesus himself shared in the suffering of the people. Minjung theology began with this realization, and thus it actively responded to the calling of the context. In the context of the era, Minjung theology of the 1970s responded to the calling by faithfully and responsibly theologizing regarding the Minjung. When the era of the Yushin military dictatorship came to an end and the era of democratization began, Minjung theology then faced different social and political context from the era that it arose in. However, I do not think that Minjung theology is no longer useful. On the contrary, in today's new social, political, and economic context, the structural evil is still unjust and has not lost its power. And the suffering and oppressed people still exist. Therefore, Minjung theology must embrace the suffering and the marginalized people in the age of climate crisis and must theologically respond to the calling of the climate crisis, as it did in the different circumstances in the 1970s. In An's article, Jesus Christ, Life of the World, Byung-Woo An said that the event of Jesus is the event of saving the life of the world and of the salvation from the bottom up in a sin of suffering and oppression, not a dogmatic way of salvation that relies on salvation from above. In a world marked by war and ecological crisis, he stressed that the salvation comes from walking with Jesus, who lives amid the suffering of the world and participating in creating life. If we apply An's understanding to today's climate crisis, the climate displaced people who are directly affected by the climate crisis caused by climate change and who are expected to become the victims in the near future are the poor and the oppressed and the groaning people, as Jesus participated in their suffering, in their desperation and despair, churches and theologians must discover the meaning of the climate crisis. And together we must bring about the event of salvation and save the broken lives, including ours. Byung-Woo An noted as follows: God is God only when God exists in public. Therefore, God cannot belong to anyone. God needs to be shared in public. It is God when God is above all and for all. So An defined God as a being who exists as Gong, G-O-N-G, you can see on the screen. To exist as Gong means not to be privatized. An sees the event of human beings being expelled from paradise as an attempt by humans to privatize God. Humans' desire to become equal to God stems from a wrongful heart seeking to privatize God and the power of God. So, quote, in Genesis, there is a story about the fall of humankind. Whatever specifically it may be, it represents something that should not be privatized. It should be God's, as Bible puts it. And sociologically speaking, Gong refers to things that cannot be privatized and things that should not be privatized. So An believed that the sin committed by the first human beings in the book of Genesis was fundamentally related to the Creator God and to humans' desire to privatize not only the creative power of God, but also the created. Humans' desire to privatize God's public creation, which cannot be privatized, created a systemic and structural sin. Similarly, An points out that cause of the murder of the story of Cain and Abel was a desire to monopolize God. This desire for exclusive dominance and the human desire to privatize God not only broke the relationship between God and human, but ultimately provided the foundation for the breaking up of the relationship between human and nature. An presented the concept of God as Gong as the opposite to privatization. Thus, God is not a being or concept that can be privatized by anyone or any group. Instead, God relates to all by being shared. Quote, there is a paradise only when the Gong exists as Gong itself. There is freedom, there is harmony, there is love and peace. What An is trying to reveal through the concept of God's Gong is God's unique ability to create, maintain, and preserve the world with love. Because of this characteristic of God, God is to be shared and not privatized. To be privatized within the particular group is contrary to God's nature of dealing with the whole world. When we comprehend this, we can talk about love and peace and harmony and freedom in our lives based on this understanding of God. An understood the ecological crisis we are facing as occurring because God is not understood as Gong. And as a result, humanity is not harmonized with God and nature. Quote, the whole mark of paradise lies in the harmony of relationships, a reality in which the relationship between God and human, which encompasses nature and humans, and everything else, flows literally and naturally like flowing water. An believed that the relationship between God and human was broken when first humans tried to privatize God, and as a result, a long history of salvation began to restore it. Humans tried to privatize God by breaking the harmony of creation that has based on the relationship of love. The descendant of humans who stubbornly inherited this desire not only revealed their ambition to privatize nature, but also steadily exploited nature. It has become difficult to find a reality where water flows naturally anywhere in the relationship between human and nature. The concept of privatization has defined nature in terms of profit rather than the concept of gong, which is interchangeable to the concept of common good. On argued that ancestors of contemporary Korean understood the reality of the harmonious and natural flow among God, human nature, and many every efforts to maintain this flow. Quote, our ancestors were wise who saw that there were spirits in the mountains. Nature has a soul. So not even a single hill was cut carelessly. However, modern people have lost their eyes to see nature and instead see nature as an object of subjugation. And as a result of their reckless mistreatment of nature, it has been swept away by ecological suicide. Having an attitude that does not objectify nature is essential to achieving harmony in the naturally flowing reality. On reveals that Korean ancestors viewed nature as an object to fear and admire, and as a subject that communicated with the divine or that contained a part of divine. Nature is viewed not as an object for human conquest or exploitation, but as a living and breathing subject of the divine power of creation that was created and maintained by the power of God's creation. The environmental crisis we face today are closely related to the global economic inequality, which has been intensified by our current understanding of economic development. It is imperative to adopt a fresh perspective of economics. If Whitehead were alive today, he might have criticized the problems of the modern global economy with his concept of the fallacy of misplaced concreteness. If we apply fallacy of the misplaced concreteness to the field of economics, it could lead to misunderstandings about the nature of economic concepts and phenomena. Carr puts it this way: the result of success of economics as academic discipline is that conclusions are drawn about the real world by deduction from abstractions with little awareness of the danger involved. Treating the numbers on the stock market as a real, tangible entity that can determine the health of an economy or represent all economic indicators and their complex relationship would be an example of the fallacy of misplaced concreteness. These economic concepts are abstractions that represent only a certain aspect of economic activities, but they do not necessarily capture the full complexity of economic interactions and behavior in it. If we really put our trust on those numbers and quantify the indicators derived from the abstract concepts, we are committing the fallacy of the misplaced concreteness. Therefore, it is important to recognize the limitation of economic concepts and models and avoid mistaking them for the complete reality of economic activities. Instead, we should approach economic analysis with a nuanced understanding of the complexity and the diversity of economic behavior and interactions. The fallacy of misplaced concreteness can also have significant implications for the way we understand and respond to ecological crisis. When we treat the natural world as if we're simply a collection of resources to be exploited for human benefit, we are committing this fallacy. I'm out of time right now. argues that community is a critical aspect of reality that has been consistently overlooked and abstracted from modern economics. So he suggests that simply applying existing method or theorem to individualistic models is not sufficient to address this problem, and that a new premise is needed to more fully incorporate the idea of community into the economic thinking. It's gone. I think this is the core of my presentation part, is about the common good. So I'm just going to read this only the summary then. The privatization of God and the nature leads to exploitation and systematic failure. And redefining the common good and prioritize planet and people over individual interest or privatization and profits. Effective policies using money for the common good can promote a sustainable and equitable development. So An's theology and his description of God suggests us to reveal the characteristic of God, which supports the common good. So in the face of ecological crisis, we should not lose hope, but believe that the children of God, all we are, we can lead all the creation from death to life. And An's theology promotes a new community of Minjung that is achieved through the proclaiming the kingdom of God and the echoing Kauf's vision for the community as a unity, as a unit for the new economy, for the common good. And An and Kauf's vision involves in the paradigm shift towards the organic interconnectedness, recognizing the inseparable connection between Minjung and nature as a part of whole being. So life is one and many, and life is a whole being. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Lee, for the interesting presentation, and thank you also for introducing the Korean Minjung theology and interpreting it for the current situation and to address the current, to apply for the current context. The Gong, I like the privatization of God. Using the concept of Gong is very fresh and impressive. The Gong means, I might not be 100% right, but the public, the civic versus the individual and private. So Gong is kind of the public, and I think still we are market or private sectors and public sectors and government sectors is kind of two extreme or two different areas, but as a civic research activist, I realized that I am more inclined to put focus on that areas to make it grow or to make it more influential, and then the answer might be there. Anyhow, also, I totally agree with the importance of the organic understanding of the world and the concept of the panentheistic God. So as I appreciate Andrew's attempt to link Whiteheadian term with economics or economic concept, I also appreciate Dr. Lee's attempt to reinterpret Minjung theology for the current situation and ecological context. Yeah, as I said, today's topic is, the title is Rethinking the Economy and Community for the Common Good. So we have to talk about economy and community with the relations to each other, plus the meaning of the term for the common good too. So the commons, the gong, related with the gong, and non-profits or civic sectors or civic solidarity economy, or the third sectors are all those very similar kinds of terminologies and areas that we need to focus, I believe. Okay, yeah. Sorry. Oh, yeah, I'm going to do that, right. So the title of this, so here, for the common good indicates and implies a transition representing the current urgent task, the climate crisis. So I think the transition should be a civilizational transition that includes a transformation of the social system. Here again, I think the economy and community are two very important factors. I thought to myself about the interconnection among today's three presentation topics, but I'm not sure whether three presenters would present as I expected. So please, even now after your presentation, my expectations and questions have not changed. Therefore, in order to move forward, it is necessary to discuss what kinds of form and contents the term for the public interest has in it for the common good, and in what way its values will work. So the next, we need to change the social system, especially the economic system. In that regard, what problems should be changed in the current capitalist economy, and how should they be introduced? So from Andrew's presentation, people just say that everything in capitalism is a problem, but isn't that too general? So now I'd like to ask three speakers to share their thoughts on this. If this is already been covered, provide a brief summary, and if not, tell us what you think. That's the first question. And the second question is, three of you is about the question about community. As Professor John Cobb always emphasizes, and many people talk about the local and community, but why community? And how to compete with the profit sectors if not completely replacing the existing mainstream profit economy, how can these areas survive and flourish? So as for the last question, I believe that the new economy should be sustainable, self-sufficient, circular, and resilient, especially based on locality and community. So I hope Andrew and Megan's presentation covers some of that. So please tell us what you think about combination of the two and the way the community and the economy are integrated. Specifically, there are job creation and income generation based on community business. And it may be about essential goods for life or products related to social values such as energy, food, care, and education. And it could be a local currency or time bank. So please give us your thoughts on that in turns. Anyone could start first.
It's a very easy task, thank you. Nothing too difficult to cover there. I'll just say a few words briefly because I want to get to the audience questions too as much as possible. But the thing that stands out to me, Guna, in response to your questions is that if we change our understanding of what privatization means in terms of interdependence rather than independence, it already begins to shift the entire paradigm we're talking about to be a person is to be a person in community. And I think that changes everything about how we relate to one another, how we relate to the natural world. and should be a starting place for a new kind of economy, much like the kind that Megan has been discussing. But
Yeah, I think I would build off what Andrew said. It's a new way of thinking. Like we live in a capitalistic system, and it's not going to change overnight. And so we have to begin making these changes about how do we want to do business? How do we want to deploy our essential resources? It's like energy. It's not going to go away. The need for energy is not going to go away, but how we deploy it can change the lives of our communities, and it can slowly change this society as well. So as when we're thinking, like, it can be privatized, or it can be owned, it can circulate wealth, and it can benefit individuals. I mean, it's a big shift, and it's hard, as we all know. But it's thinking, like Andrew said, it's not about just the individual, but it's how the impact webs out. Like, what are we hoping to accomplish, and how can we make it so it's benefiting the most in society rather than the few?
I'd like to answer the question with the quoting John Cobb's. Yeah, it's a good strategy, right? Yeah. So, an economics for the common good is what ecological humanism calls for, and even more what stewardship for creation calls for. So, the connection between the common good and ecological humanism highlights the idea of economic systems must not serve not only the well-being of people, but also the planet. So I think this is a very important aspect that we all need to remember in talking about the capitalism and the world economic system. And we need to think first about the well-being of the people, especially the people will be suffering, and also will have the marginalized, will be the marginalized people in the community, and those are the core community that we need to focus on in the economics. I'm not sure whether I answered your question.
Okay, shall we pass the mic to the audience?
So the theory I get from John Cobb, and my questions from Megan, the practical, what's happening from you, is hope only at the local, like communal level, and the national level is a lost cause, or do you think there could still be national change? And if it's local, that's perhaps fine, and like your project is really great, but I'm really curious what you think about that.
Yeah, I definitely don't think hope is only at the national level, but I think to get to the national level, the sustainable way to move about it is to start local. And that's why in the slide about how we expand, it's expanding locally and it's expanding in the communities that need these resources and these jobs and this economic revitalization the most. But as that network expands, the change we create is together. So it's the power of each local community as the model expands across the country that generally will begin to change the national system. And so we talk a lot about localism. And I think the values and the change that we want to see in the world start at the local level. And as more and more and more people get on board, that's how you create societal and larger change. I hope that helps.
I wanted to pick up on Dr. Jung's pointer to the fact that critiques of capitalism might be a little bit overly simplistic. So if we imagine a world where everyone is enlightened or awakened or living from or as the inner Christ, it seems to me that any economic system, a form of capitalism, a form of communism, something in between, could work and lead to equivalent forms of total flourishing. So then, isn't the situation a little more complex than just saying, here's a problematic system, but rather it calls for an inquiry into the relationship between those processes of awakening or rechristing at the individual level, and the systemic pressures, whether any system, communist, capitalistic, or whatever, suppresses or represses that process. And then the question is, like, what are we to do in that much more complex scenario?
I would say I completely agree that the characterization of capitalism is often overly simplified, and I think what I was trying to do, at least in my simplification of it, was to point to something underneath it. So it's, I think if capitalism is primarily about privatization, socialism primarily about public sharing commons and stuff, what happens when we blur the distinction between the two because we recognize an identity of interdependence? So I think that already begins to not, so the simplification in that sense is a way of saying, okay, we have to move past the paradigms that are beneath the expressions of capitalism or socialism or these sort of economic paradigms. But I think, I like what John Cobb and Herman Daly say, which is this: our position is that centralized economic planning is insufficient, that allocations are better affected in the market than by bureaucratic planning. The role of government is to set fair conditions within which the market can operate. It's also it's responsible for setting the overall size or scale of the market. The market is not the end of social, and it is not the right instrument through which the ends of society should be set. We favor, Cobb and Daly, private ownership, which sounds like capitalism, of the means of production. We favor, though, the widest possible participation in that ownership, which now sounds like socialism, including worker-owned ownership of factories against its concentration in a few hands. So I actually think it's not either or, but something different altogether.
I was going to ask a question to Dr. Dongwoo Lee, but it seems like, Andrew, you just basically barged in and answered it.
You're welcome.
I'm still gonna bring up the topic because I think it's essential. Maybe we can deepen it a little bit more because it draws from your presentation and also Megan's presentation. I have this thing discovered through Whitehead that I try to exercise in the relationship with my wife, which is the many become one and are increased by one. And I think of our relationship actually as a third person. So I think that there are three people in our relationship, in our marriage. We don't have children yet, but still there's three. There's me, her, and us. And all of these three people they have needs, and they have to be given room. So I was wondering, and maybe you can choose who wants to answer the question, how we can get to the point that communities are actually being seen as let's say, you all are familiar with the problem of the commons, the tragic of the commons by Elinor Ostrom. So how can we nourish communal values, communal ownership, but at the same time not fall into communism, which would then maybe cause a lack of ambition, a lack of ownership, a lack of the feeling of belonging. So it basically builds on what you said, Andrew, so maybe one of the others would answer.
Well, for me, I've been thinking about that a lot as well when I've been studying in economics in my BA program, but I didn't have any answer yet. But I've been thinking that maybe in our system right now we are residing in, maybe the company like a co-op, corporation might be an answer for the systematic failure of the capitalism that we are experiencing right now. But so we are sharing and sharing the ownership, and or maybe we can say it's a public ownership, like a co ownership, we can say. So I think that is the important the elements that we need to think about, not the privatization, but on the opposite side.
Do you want me to answer too? I do. Sorry. Yeah, I love what Dong Wu said, and I think, like you said, it's it's a balance, then you have to balance privatization on one side, communism on the other end. And I do think co-ops are one way to get at that, because people then do feel motivated. I think they also feel part of a community, because the decisions in the business or the organization that you're in are now collective. And it starts to foster that mindset that everything we're doing is for not just me or not just you, but it's for this community in this organization. And then I think it allows us to begin to think more broadly, like there's the community in the organization. Also now, how does this impact the community beyond? And so I think circling that way of thinking, even on the smaller level, will help us expand to what this looks like at a society level.
Megan, my question's for you. Your presentation is really hopeful, but it also reminded me of the slogan of the Texas energy independence movement of the last 100 years, which was power generated by Texans for Texans. And in the last 3 years, we've seen how disastrous that has been. So in CHIRP and the program, what kind of plans do y'all have or mechanisms do you have to keep from repeating that kind of disastrous localism?
Yeah, I don't know the Texas situation, I think, well enough to make sure I'm addressing what we're not repeating. Can you explain it a little bit more?
Well, so the basic idea was that when the national energy grids were being created, that Texas was not going to be included, that Texas was going to have its own energy grid that they were going to control and input, with the exception of the city of El Paso. And in the last 3 years, major winter storms related to climate change have rendered that grid just useless, and then increasing heat in the summer has also rendered it useless. But because they're not connected with other parts of the national grid, there's no way for them to have good backups when the entire city of Austin goes down.
Yeah, I'll say that the way that we're integrating our energy systems, we're not saying like Edison be gone forever, because we know Edison will always still play a role until we find a great, we can revolutionize the entire system. But so for CHIRP, like when we're installing energy systems, they're still part of the larger grid. It's just that, and Edison will still control the distribution of energy, right? The energy that's created by community solar or any of these places is still distributed into an overall grid, but how people are paying for their energy is going not to this behemoth organization, but to a local nonprofit that will reinvest. I know we have talked a lot about, like microgrids and getting like totally off the grid. But I think there's still a lot of work that needs to be done. There's a lot of interest in like battery systems and backup. But then there's the problem of like, I don't know if there's enough lithium to support the amount of batteries that would require. So I think for a time being, the large utilities are still essential to maintaining just reliability, resiliency across the grid, but we have to start rethinking about how the role that they play in their even their resiliency to renewable energy. And I think there's been a lot of thoughts about like local energy co-ops, and there are some, like in Texas probably, where there is local energy production and control rather than larger utilities. And I think that might end up being more of the case as we go on into the future. And maybe there's a network then among all these local distributions, but the grid and the infrastructure in the grid is a massive problem, and it's also a massive problem in terms of like even supplying the amount of energy that we use in the United States, and we see that all the time. I don't think I did a great job of answering your question, but
I actually think it is a good job, because I think it gets to this question of local versus regional or national or global, and I think it's not either or. It's communities of communities of communities, and that's a process view.
Actually, I handed as the second one, but I waited long, so I'll be short. Okay, Dr. Lee, thank you for introducing Minjung theology for comparative eco-ethics. Actually, traditionally, the demarcation or classification of Kong and Sa, the private realm and the public realm, has been for centuries genderized as the public realm as women's prohibition, and the private realm is almost identified with women and the nature and all other oppressed groups. So that's one thing. Another thing is actually the fluidity of individual realm and also public realm in terms of encountering and guarding God. You said like God is not privatized to anyone, but God is to be shared. Then clarifying your clear distinction of Kong, the public realm, as little bit like traditional kind of dualistic, genderized part that I am not really satisfied with that part. And what is the God that you said God is to be shared? Is the God power or pop rise or life that you said, then is kind of divine material force as God being? Then why it's only for to be shared part, not in the private realm? God is very intimate in many sense. So.
Thank you. That is a very good question, and I honestly say that I never thought about in that way, but that is a very wonderful way to think about the concept of Minjung theology's terminology, Kong. Yes, it is related to the Confucianism idea of the public and private, but I believe Byung-Mu An's, the theologian Byung-Mu An's interpretation of Kong is not about the public sector and the private sector, this bifurcation, but it's more like the interpretation of the Genesis story. And he's trying to make a case for the economic sense. So I read him as in that way. And I totally agree that in some sense, the concept of God. There's a lot of story, but I'm going to make it very short. You asked about what part of God is shared among people, and I think the Byung-Mu An meant to be think that the elements that being shared by God is love and peace. So that's my reading.
Let's give the panel a hand, friends. Thank you very much. Excellent. All right, let's continue the conversation over a 15-minute break. Coffee is hot. We'll be back at 11 o'clock sharp. Thank you.
Yeah.
You might say love. I almost leaned over and said, is it love? Is it love? And then, it was, so that's good. That's it. Hey, hey. Nicholas. Andrew. I don't have a car, but I can write to you.
Oh, good.
I don't know. I was a physicist. I was my massive failure of their system is that one organization holds the entire state, right? Well, with the exception of El Paso. Yes. I'm from El Paso. Yeah, with the exception of El Paso. One month in this place is it's going, right? So, yeah, like the I'll send you an email. We'll check. You will be okay. Good. Thank you so much. I'm Tom Grimshaw. Yes. Rather than do you actually remember me? I do. Right. How are you? So, no, it was a
Oh, good.
yeah.
My brain was like spinning like, oh, no,
No, because I think it's a huge problem. But the other thing, you're right, the grid is
I'm curious about energy. Oh, it's fine.
just really quick. So, I'm teaching art.
What's that? You're third, yeah. And we have, I want to say, we have 20 minutes, you know, and I'll let you know when you have 2 minutes left.
Guess I should sit over here then. As well. Right, team.
Oh, these lights are even brighter than I realized. Oh, I forgot my. Now I have to figure out how. I guess I can use my watch. I'll move my stuff out of your way.
I think we're good to start. Good stuff. Great presentation. And my biggest laugh of the week during your presentation. Invisible hand. Phenomenal.
You live in Copenhagen now?
Yeah, I've been there for about a year and a half.
Oh boy, nice. Yeah. I've never been there. Been to Oslo and Brussels, been around there.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
but not there. So.
It's a neat city. I mean, it's much more. It's different in ways I wouldn't have predicted.
Oh, okay. That's what makes travel neat.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. But it's like I think the cycling. It's like the most salient feature of the city. It's like Amsterdam.
Like Amsterdam is that way, I know. I remember going to the train station in Amsterdam a few years ago. You just see hundreds and hundreds of bikes parked there.
But also, people leave their bikes outside, they leave their helmets on their bikes unlocked.
Yeah.
Like, that would never happen here.
It's an American thing. What's that about?
Right. It's a little suspicious of it.
My university, they publish any crime near on campus.
This is like
I'd say about
a spectrum of
2/3
technology.
reports
Paper,
are stolen
Paperlike,
bicycles.
tablet.
That's good. People break in the middle of the night, you know, and steal
no.
bicycles.
Yeah. Can you remind me which university?
I'm Seattle.
Okay, great. When I'm here, I'm in Portland.
Is it colder than this in New Orleans right now? Warmer?
No, it's warmer, yeah.
Oh, nice.
60s and 70s right
Went
now.
down to Portland early March. So
I had no idea it could be this cold in Southern California.
Really
The weather
surprised
will
me.
be better by then.
yeah, we're
Really surprised. And it also didn't occur to me that they wouldn't have heating and things because it's not usually this cold, so it feels as cold in here as out there.
I've been told it is a colder. It is a colder winter, but yeah. Ugh.
Okay, friends, let's find our seats. I am happy to introduce Dr. Daniel Dombrowski as the moderator for this session. He is a professor of philosophy at Seattle University. Among his 22, maybe, 23 now, Dan? 23 books are Rethinking the Ontological Argument, Contemporary Athletics and Ancient Greek Ideals, Process Thought and Political Liberalism, and recently Process Mysticism. He's the editor of the journal Process Studies, which we've all benefited from for a number of years, and he's the past president of the Metaphysical Society of America. And today he's going to be moderating our session on power, peace, and politics in process. Please welcome Dan Dombrowski.
Thank you. I'd like to start by thanking the two Andrews and whoever else is responsible for this conference. Anybody who's ever put on a conference, you know how difficult it is, and so it's really, really wonderful work you're doing. So our first speaker in this session is Stephanie Arev, and Stephanie is a political theorist drawn to the themes of democratic pluralism, anti-imperialism, ecofeminism, vital materiality, and the more than human. Her work engages such themes from a perspective informed by the tradition of process philosophy, and it frequently draws on the life sciences and arts to enrich its political investigations. Erev is an assistant professor of political science at Portland State University, but currently on leave from Portland State, working in Copenhagen on a 2-year project, Vital Politics, Rethinking Normativity in the Anthropocene. So Stephanie's paper today is Process, Ecology, and Political Subjectivity.
Can you hear me? Okay, thanks. No, you cannot. How about now? Thanks. Okay. I'm going to just dive right in. My question is as follows. What would a climate politics look like that did not begin from a bifurcation of nature? Spoiler, my answer is right there in my title, but I'll come back to that later. Having been circling this question, which is a very urgent question, for the past couple of years, I've come to believe that in order to mount a compelling response to it, it's necessary to experiment with novel methods of critique. For critique is today so closely associated with politics that methods other than critique tend frequently to be overlooked or disregarded as not political, or worse, to be derided for being, or so it is claimed, supportive of the status quo. But critique, I submit, finds itself at an impasse when it approaches the awful problem of ecological ruin and associated task of unraveling and depotentializing the habits of thought, feeling, perception, and action that created it. This is because the bifurcation of nature upon which critical theory still rests, predominantly, diminishes our capacity to experience climatic transformations as important, and it thereby innervates the action, the politics, critique is meant to spark. This paper is part of a larger project which draws process philosophy into conversation with sympathetic works in ecofeminism, decolonial theory, and affect theory in an effort to vitalize critique, to infuse practices of critique, as Bruno Latour might say, with a vital spirit, doing so that climatic processes can be experienced and understood as participants in the making, unmaking, and remaking of value, aim, interest, power, will, as participants, that is, in politics. Before I continue, I want to emphasize, and this is important, because it doesn't come through so clearly in the rest of the talk, that my interest is not in giving a critique of critique, or not, at least it's not only that, I do sort of end up doing that. Critical theory is utterly indispensable today. You know, even if we devoted this entire conference to it, we wouldn't have time to talk about all the reasons why we need critical theory today. And I use it in my own research. So that's not the goal. The interest, rather, is in issuing an appeal to critical theorists to take seriously as political practices they might more readily classify as artistic or experimental. Specifically, that methods of retuning experience of what I will later describe as work thought performs on itself, which I take from Michel Foucault, credibly can be understood as critical methods, as practices of critique. The effort, then, undertaken in this paper to recall something said yesterday is to show what a processual natural philosophy can do, in this case, politically. If critique has indeed run out of steam, then political theory did not receive that memo. In the now 20 years since publication of Bruno Latour's famous essay, Why Has Critique Run Out of Steam, the influence and esteem enjoyed by critique have only grown. Just last year, for example, New Political Science, which describes itself as the radical section of the American Political Science Association, was rechristened Critical Political Science. Indeed, critique not only radiates intellectual splendor, viewed often, I intimated this a moment ago, as the most or even the only rigorous method of scholarly analysis, it has acquired a certain moral cachet as well. To be radical is now to be critical almost by definition. Now, the reverence for critique within political theory is perhaps unsurprising when you consider that its leading figures situate critique at the heart of politics itself. Thus, Nancy Fraser writes that politics requires a genre of critical theorizing. What sort of critical theorizing, you might ask? Well, she goes on to tell you, a genre of critical theorizing that blends normative argument and empirical sociocultural analysis in a diagnosis of the times. And this, she says, is a fairly typical position, a position regarding the relation of critique to politics, held by Marxists and many others, is and ought, fact and value, not essentially, variously, and ambiguously entwined, but rather in need of being blended. I confess not being quite a Marxist myself, although I do love Marx, that I first encountered Fraser's statement neither in a classroom nor a library, but I'm going to mispronounce this, to cook in, a kitchenette at the University of Copenhagen's Department of Political Science. In need of a break after several hours of writing, I had gone in search of coffee. And lo, someone had had Fraser's words emblazoned on a mug. In his essay on critique, Latour lamented the excessive attachment of philosophers to their coffee mugs. The problem with philosophers, he wrote, is that because their jobs are so hard, they drink a lot of coffee, and thus use in their arguments an inordinate quantity of pots, mugs, and jugs, to which sometimes they might add the occasional rock. Latour was a philosopher himself, of course, but here he was speaking as a scholar of science and technology studies, and his regret was that a certain table of values growing out of the bifurcation of nature, namely a glorification of human-made things over mere natural and technological objects, cultivated within critique a disrespect and a disregard for the agency exercised by non-human actants. And Latour doesn't make this point, but we can, that same table of values inspires or sort of foments a disrespect and disregard for the agency exercised by entire classes of people designated as being closer to lowly nature than to enterprising, fearless culture. A theme, I think, expertly covered by people such as Val Plumwood and Carol Wayne White. Now, bound up with this disrespect, but now on a spiritual register, bifurcation, I read Latour to suggest, with Whitehead before him, fosters a form of nihilism. People have not liked it when I have used this word nihilism to describe the effects that Whitehead and Latour diagnosed, but I am not dissuaded. I think the term captures something essential of the decadent spirit that bifurcation foments, including within critical theory, an effect that was also explored in different ways by Nietzsche in The Will to Power and in the idea of a loss of belief in this world that Gilles Deleuze flirts with in his books on cinema. So I'm sticking to my guns on this one. Back to Latour. He writes, while the Enlightenment profited largely from the disposition of a very powerful descriptive tool, that of matters of fact, which were excellent for debunking a lot of beliefs, powers, and illusions, it found itself totally disarmed once matters of fact in turn were eaten up by the same debunking impetus. Or listen to Whitehead writing in a slightly different key. A scientific realism based on mechanism is conjoined with an unwavering belief in the world of men and of the higher animals as being composed of self-determining organisms. This radical inconsistency at the basis of modern thought accounts for much that is half-hearted and wavering in our civilization. The inconsistency enfeebles thought, Whitehead goes on to say, and has led us to accept superficial orderings from arbitrary standing points. The bare old matter of fact proved useful, here I'll adopt an enlightened vocabulary, in emancipating reason from the yoke of external authority, as, for example, in Kant, in effectively delegitimizing quite a lot of beliefs, powers, and illusions in circulation at the time. But the same impulse to debunk would later, however unwittingly, engender a pervasive suspicion of the real. How then to nurture attachments to this world? But what does this have to do with climate or with critique? As part of my research for this paper, I explored at some length the landscape of what I'll call, unimaginatively, climate critique, by which I mean basically the body of academic literature that brings methods of critical theory, of critique, to the intersection of politics, ethics, and the climate crisis. I undertook this exploration in an effort to understand whether, to what extent and in what ways, the bifurcation of nature Latour identifies at the basis of critique shapes and constrains critical political imaginaries today. I'm afraid I have to sort of speed through this part of the paper, and I won't do justice to the innovative and really important critical theoretical work that's being done. But I do so, I speed through it, sort of run roughshod over it, in order to prioritize a demonstration of what seems to me to be missing across this otherwise quite exciting terrain. My survey, which was expansive but by no means complete, showed that climate critiques tend to set their sights on one or more of three main objects: the structures of fossil fuel capitalism, the knowledges and practices of natural science, and theories, proposals, policies, and programs set forth, whether in the academic literature or in institutional settings, to address and respond to the climate emergencies underway. The field is very varied and diverse, yet across its many sort of different lines of analysis, the role of critique in climate politics actually appears in pretty similar terms. The political efficacy of critique appears to flow from the expose function critique performs. By exposing hidden forces fueling planetary degradation or social injustice, or both, critique on this way of thinking clears a path for action that would upend such forces or neutralize their harmful effects. Thus, Andreas Malm, for example, posits that the interests of the ruling classes and fossil capital have so corrupted official channels of socio-political change that any hope of averting ecological catastrophe rests in bottom-up social movements. He's probably right about that, particularly those engaging in strategic sabotage. Quote, "To appeal to the reason and common sense of the ruling classes would evidently be futile," Malm writes, "because the commitment to the endless accumulation of capital wins out every time. The climate movement must learn to disrupt business as usual," end quote. Similarly, and despite a different substantive focus, Dylan Asafo prizes critical race theory for its ability to hold climate change law accountable to principles of racial justice. Here, critique exposes forces of what Asafo calls judicial white privilege, which otherwise operate undetected to insulate powerful white actors from the ecological destruction they cause, forcing people of color to bear the brunt of the harms. If we return to Fraser, Malm's critical theoretical approach enables a climate politics to take shape because of the way it offers a diagnosis of the times, combining empirical sociocultural analysis with normative theorizing. It suggests that formal institutions are hopelessly corrupted and argues that in the face of such corruption, there is a need to take matters into our own hands. In Asafo's analysis, the critical diagnosis combines an account of the ongoing oppressive effects of histories of racial injustice and domination with a program for social transformation. In Asafo's words, adopting a racial justice framing of climate change enables social movements to effectively change the hearts and minds of lawmakers and inspire them to make meaningful strides in climate mitigation and adaptation for peoples of color at the forefront of climate change's impact. Both, I mean, who would argue with either of these programs, right? Certainly, yes, sign me up. I'm on board. Yet, it struck me as I was reading that not one of the climate critiques I encountered had taken climate change itself as an object, had sought to engage with material processes of planetary transformation, melting ice sheets, discombobulating ocean conveyor systems, etc. Instead, critical theory seems largely to restrict its analyses to how climate change has been represented and or caused by human beings, or else to human designs to temper it, reverse it, or circumvent its worst effects. It is as though critical thinking cannot enter into the materiality of climatic change, and thus that the only place for critique to go is into the thinking, which includes the saying and the doing of other people. The general impression, and it is a peculiar impression, at least to me, the general impression one gets is that climate is somehow on the outside or external, even in some cases incidental to the politics of climate change. Said somewhat differently, critical theory would seem to hold that activities to forge new relations with the non-human world, while they might constitute a techno-scientific project, would not be an ethico-political one. How can this be? If critique is the most or even the only rigorous method of political study, and if it indeed occupies the heart of politics itself, what does it mean for climate politics that climate critique seems to exclude climatic processes from both arms of its reach? You know, we could take up the sort of, why does it see empirical and normative as, but even if we accept this, climatic processes still seem outside. So it seems to apprehend such processes as appropriate objects neither of empirical study, leave that to the natural scientists, we do socio-political analysis, nor normative theorizing. For climate, on this view, part of nature is meaningless, is empty in itself. I don't suspect that I need to spend too much time with you all on these points about bifurcation, so I'm going to just say them very briefly. The bifurcation of nature leads to a habitual sequestration of a certain number of qualities. Let's call them intentionality, reflexive consciousness, the sense of value, moral intentions, aesthetic taste, feelings, etc. So a habitual sequestration of these qualities within the interior of the human subject. The concept of nature has become, in Didier Debèze's words, a machine of disqualification, disqualifying all the qualities of things that do not fall within the dimensions attributed to nature, namely mathematical qualities and physical qualities, as if everything else came from superficial dimensions that did not belong to nature, right? Aesthetic sense, moral sense, pleasure, interests, importance, and so on. Nature, according to this inherited conception, is even the opposite of abstraction, which does not come under our constructions, but would impose itself on us beyond the artifices of thought. Nature here is precisely the space outside our abstraction, outside of our reach, outside of our ideas, that space of reality that is independent of the manner in which it is characterized, independent of the ways we link it together, that would fall under the questioning subject, the human subject. So what to do? What traditions of critique are most suitable or amenable to the type of vitalization I referred to earlier, to modes of climate politics not fueled by such machines of disqualification? I turn next to a perhaps unlikely source, the philosophy of Michel Foucault. And I'm going to have to zoom ahead here too and just give you the essentials, but hopefully that will be enough. Foucault's critical philosophy may seem an unlikely source to draw upon to vitalize critique, to move climate politics beyond bifurcation, for a whole host of valid reasons, none of which I wish to contest. Sort of Foucault's alignment with post-structuralism and certain dualisms that nevertheless remain intact there. But Foucault, as I read him, like his teacher Georges Canguilhem, is also sensitive to what I want to call the vitality or even the material dimension of thinking, to the affective, infra-representational modes of thought which come into absorptive contact with thoughts outside, below the threshold of awareness, or prehension, if you like. And Foucault is alive to the murky and shifting, but irreducible interpenetration of thought and action, and thus to the political efficacy of transforming our modes of thought. Criticism for Foucault is in fact understood as work thought performs on itself. We can't sort of poo-poo the political force of thinking for Foucault, nor dismiss the work of thinking on itself as merely self-involved, disconnected, and even irrelevant to the goings-on of the real world. Thought, he says, is often hidden, but always drives everyday behaviors. There's always a little thought occurring, even in the most stupid institutions. There's always a thought, even in silent habits, or if you prefer, Whitehead, as we think we live. My way into a climate politics beyond bifurcation, and there are many, many different ways, each of which carries with it its own real dangers, is to bring climatic processes into political subjectivity, into thinking, not as determining forces, but as forces of agitation, as unsettling intensities. As agitating forces, climatic processes can now be understood as processes with the potential to energize vital political projects. Yet, and I'm not going to spend too much time on this, I've published work on this before. My project here is really to sort of talk about how this kind of thinking and doing politics vitally can be understood as critique. But just to give you the sort of basic sketch, when we write, so understanding climatic processes as forces of agitation allows us to understand them as processes with the potential to energize vital political projects, yet they're not for that reason benign, right, when we understand them affectively in this way. For such unsettling intensities can energize, say, the creation of new, more ecological and egalitarian tables of value, but they can also stoke reactionary fascist modes of resentment politics. What matters is how we receive and relate to these intensities. So again, not as determinants, but as adjutants. What then of critique? Well, critique understood as work thought performs upon itself, when we take this more expansive affective understanding of thought, is this receiving and responding. It is such a retuning of experience if we undertake that in a deliberate way, when we undertake experimental somatic affective practices to come alive to the climatic transformations within. Climate critique of this sort approaches political subjects not only as agents and patients of the climate emergency, although of course they are those things, but also as sites of material, affective, which is to say, climatic transformation. Thank you.
Our second speaker is Yuki Schwartz, an assistant professor of constructive and political theologies and the associate dean, she's an administrator, okay, of academics and assessment at the Claremont School of Theology. Areas of scholarship include de-imperial and decolonial studies, Asian and Asian American theology, political theology, and critical race, gender, and sexuality studies. Yuki's current research investigates the intersections of affect, politics, and U.S. imperialism in Asia during the Cold War and its afterlife. Yuki's paper is titled Messianic Transformation, the Political Shame of the Coming Community.
I am afraid I have no slides for you, so I will try to be engaging with my voice and presentation. In this paper, I will attempt to explicate Italian political theologian Giorgio Agamben's understanding of shame and its relationship to messianic inoperativity, and consider its theological implications in beginning conversation with process theology's concept of creative transformation. Now, creative transformation is a much more positive, progressive, and Christological understanding of salvation than Agamben's very nihilistic conception of messianism. However, I am hopeful that this lens helps me construct an understanding of shame and its possibilities and impossibilities that will be useful for communities in working toward creating ethics of practice focused on love, care, and solidarity, encompassed in this ambivalent understanding of new and different ways of being together. I begin with Agamben's essay, The Idea of Shame, in which Agamben proposes the idea of shame arrives in Western European thought through a scene in the Parmenides where Socrates' encounter with squalor reminds him that filth, waste, and dust are fundamental parts of human life, both material and metaphysical. Agamben encapsulates shame not just as embarrassment or humiliation, but as the inability for human beings to fully and truly understand themselves, either so that they can live up to their potential or know themselves amidst the muck of life. To confront this truth about ourselves means confronting our own essential contingency, our lack, our inability, quote, to take our mortal measure more fully, a shame at not truly understanding ourselves, end quote. It is here where Agamben sets down a version of his vision of shame that will make up his argument later in his book, Remnants of Auschwitz, quote, shame is the index of the unheard of, the frightening proximity of man with himself, end quote. It is not, in typical understandings of shame, it is not the experience of inappropriate being or otherness, but it is the experience of being itself. Agamben turns to Kafka to ruminate on the need, quote, not to liberate oneself from shame, but to liberate shame. It is what Joseph K. strives to achieve during the entire period of his trial, and it is to save his own shame, not his innocence, that at the end he obstinately bows to the headman's knife. It seems to him, we read at the moment of his death, that his shame would survive him, end quote. Thus, Agamben posits a shame that through submission to it unveils relationships, actions, or values that go beyond the individual self. A shame that which would survive the individual, that is not the image or idealization of humanity common to philosophy or literature, but centered on an ambivalent creature who in encountering and submitting to shame, challenges accepted wisdoms about what it means to be human. This ambivalence is at the heart of Agamben's ongoing and overall philosophical project, investigating the constitution and limits of language, law, authority, and sovereignty. In his book, Homo Sacer, Agamben asks the question about what life is and how that life is taken up within the biopolitical machine of modern democratic systems, and he unearths two concepts from Greek philosophy and law: bios, which is political life that takes place within the city, and zoe, natural life that is not related to politics. According to Agamben, modern politics is not constituted around the inclusion of zoe, or natural life, within the city or within our political lives, but rather modern politics is focused on this zone that separates the natural and the political life, turning them into bare life. Biopolitics uses bare life in order to define its sovereign power and cannot separate itself from bare life. The historical figure who most prominently represents bare life in Agamben's thought is the Homo Sacer, literally the sacred man, whose life is not protected by the law, so that anyone who kills him is not committing a homicide, and yet this death of the sacred man is not considered a sacrifice. Just as sovereigns enact authority through killing their subjects without penalty, their subjects can enact their own power and authority by killing the Homo Sacer. In the modern construction of biopolitics, sovereignty is enacted through bare life, in which the sovereign leaves some life abandoned within these zones of indistinction where the law no longer operates but still exists, and in doing so, in existing, defines the law itself. A concept fundamentally related to bare life and Homo Sacer is the state of exception, in which the sovereign suspends their authority, and yet their authority is still defined by that suspension. The historical site in which this state of exception is most apparent is that of the camp, in which in Homo Sacer and in Remnants of Auschwitz are the literal physical death camps operated by the Nazi regime, although versions of this camp exist and have existed in the United States and around the world. These camps exemplify sovereign power and bare life because they exist only as the result of the state of exception, where law and lawlessness, human and inhuman, combine so that there is no difference between them, and which legally exist because the law was suspended in order to allow them to exist. It is in this zone of indistinction where Agamben finds shame, depicted through the unexpected pink flush on the cheeks of a student whose murder by the SS is reported in survivor testimony. Agamben wonders why this blush, this flush, quote, like a mute apostrophe flying through time to reach us, to bear witness to him, end quote. Here Agamben takes up his reflection from his essay, The Idea of Shame, that that shame will survive this young student, as well as Robert Antelme, the witness who saw this shameful blush. Drawing from the psychoanalytic work of Emmanuel Levinas, Agamben links the blush to Levinas's theory that shame is the exposure of the self to the self without escape. Agamben writes, quote, "To be ashamed means to be consigned to something that cannot be assumed. But what cannot be assumed is not something external. Rather, it originates in its own intimacy. It is what is most intimate in us, for example, our own physiological life. Here, the I is thus overcome by its own passivity, its own most sensibility, yet this expropriation and desubjectification is also an extreme and irreducible presence of the I to itself. It is as if our consciousness collapsed and seeking to flee in all directions was simultaneously expropriated by an irrefutable order to be present at its own defacement, at the expropriation of what is most its own. In shame, the subject has no other content than its own desubjectification. It becomes witness to its own disorder, its own oblivion as a subject. This double movement, which is both subjectification and desubjectification, is shame. In encountering this double movement of both subjectification and desubjectification in shame, the subject encounters the zone of indistinction, in which exists the subject's multiple potentialities and impotentialities, to have agency and to be under the rule of another, quote, to be subjected and to be sovereign, end quote. There is also another meaning for the word subject that Agamben intertwines into his explanation, the unsayability and the instability of the pronoun I as the referent to the subject, both of which point back to shame's way of closing down communication and disrupting certainties about identity and self. Figures and remnants of Auschwitz who represent this incommunicability of the I and the subject include camp inmates who mentally and emotionally disconnected from the world and those they shared that world with, becoming both objects of shame and disgust to their fellow inmates, and demonstrating a further zone of indistinction in the camps, where the human and the inhuman among the inmates who were already made bare life to Nazi regime found another way of distinguishing between human and inhuman, or finding an indistinction between human and inhuman. Agamben takes this experience of incomprehensible inmates to argue that the incommunicability they demonstrate is a product of language itself, existing not just for them, but present at all times for any one of us. That is, if one becomes a subject through speech, the paradox is that through speaking, the subject cannot fully assume the signification of the pronoun I, an experience that ends in desubjectification. A gap exists between the I and the speaker, revealing the impossibility of bearing witness to what is around them, to the death camps. This impossibility of bearing witness is due to the gap that exists between the survivor, who is able to bear witness to what they have undergone, and the dead, who are fully immersed in the totality of the camps, but cannot testify through speech to that experience. In the same way as the pronoun I cannot fully encompass the subject, so too the surviving witness cannot fully speak to what has happened in the camps. In survivor testimony, Agamben writes, the subject discovers the impossibility of speaking in the same way that the subject encounters desubjectification. It is in embracing this impossibility of both speech and subject where shame fits into Agamben's messianic conception of what he calls the coming community. The coming of this political community does not lie in the future sense of the word coming, but in this moment when community is arriving at all times into the now. The community is not one that will come about as a result of the machinations of, or acts of individuals who make it up, or even as a result of the types of individuals who make it up, but it is a community that is always in the process of coming, always shifting and living within its potentiality as well as its impotentiality through the choices, actions, or decisions that the community makes and does not make, and acts and does not enact. According to Carlos Salzani, quote, The coming of the coming community is thus an always coming, and its politics finds its place neither in the romanticism of the past nor in them yearning for a utopian future, but rather in a messianic presentness, in the realization that within the present lies the possibility of change and transformation, end quote. Shame plays a role in this coming because it creates an ever-present attunement to this possibility and impossibility, creating interruptions so that reflection and reorientation about identity, community, values, and affiliations can take place. This newness and openness associated with the coming community, associated with shame, connects also to Agamben's concept of messianism, which arises most profoundly at the end of his book, Remnants of Auschwitz, where he describes shame as a messianic power, and then continues in his following text, The Time That Remains, where he examines the Apostle Paul's messianism in depth. Rather than proposing a messianism that points toward a singular or universal oneness of perfection of humanity that is now one in God, Agamben instead proposes that in the messianic time of the now, where differences between creatures continue to divide to the point where they are impossible and irrelevant, messianic power works by rendering structures and concepts impossible so that they cannot work as they are traditionally conceived, but also frees them so that they can be imagined for new and multiple possibilities. Shame participates in this impossibility of the messianic now, in that it can prompt a visceral and immediate interruption in participation with time, with the world, and the structures that seek to control both. Shame can stop the operation of theological unworldly powers so that those who are caught in those powers come to know their unknowability. But in that unknowability, there is the possibility for the new, the different, the strange and uncanny, or the glorious and amazing. While shame has been captured by theological and secular orders who use its powers to fuel their own projects, Agamben hints that shame may be a way toward the messianic time of the now. Shame is the experience of what cannot be endured, comprehended, or assumed, countering a traditional association that salvation has with the perfect. Shame instead directs the subject toward the possibilities of newness that is always coming now. This last section of my paper is still very much a work in progress, but one that I am interested in and excited about developing further as I am exploring this depiction of messianic shame and the coming community alongside the concept of creative transformation, specifically the model that Monica Coleman presents as part of her postmodern womanist theology, Making a Way Out of No Way. Coleman draws upon John Cobb's description of creative transformation as a part of the work of God's salvation that is located in newness and novelty that takes through the process of change, that takes place through the process of change that is typically associated with Christ. However, Coleman adapts this concept of creative transformation, reading it in conversation with womanist theology and recognition of the contextual, communal, and creative coming and becoming that occurs in these communities and contexts that do not solely or necessarily relate to salvation in Christic terms. Creative transformation also disrupts imperial Christendom's emphasis on a stable or originary beingness for humans, for creations, or the divine, instead focusing on the change and novelty or newness or nowness associated with the constant process of becoming. That is, the desubjectification at the heart of messianic shame is not the nothing or the unspeakable, is not unspeakable because it is nothing or it is the utter passivity of nihilism, but rather it is caught up in the incompleteness and instability of changingness. It is, as John Cobb and David Ray Griffin write, quote, the transformation of elements through the introduction of novelty. It alters their nature and meaning without suppressing or destroying that, end quote. That which is past or considered originary or essential is not lost, but neither is it idolized, as creative transformation does not give authority to the structures, systems, or institutions that make up the world that is now, but calls attention to the possibilities and also the impossibilities that come with change. Again, Cobb's interpretation of change is a much more hopeful and positive one than Agamben, as he argues that the new is unrealized potentiality for transforming the world without destroying it. But it is not completely unlike the image Agamben provides for his understanding of shame and its role in the messianic. To bear witness to shame is to participate in profanation. To bear witness to shame is to participate in profanation, an act of destabilizing and rendering unusable the certainties and the structures that rely on categorical binaries, such as human and unhuman, sacred and profane, shameful and glorious, in ways that shore up authorities' structures of power. What is declared sacred becomes untouchable and also unchangeable, but profanation, quote, means to return to common use that which has been removed to the sphere of the sacred. To profane means not to simply abolish or erase separations, but to learn to put things to new use and to play with them. Or as Cobb writes, quote, the new builds upon the old and transfuses it with meaning it could not have apart from the new. The new not only frees us from the old, but it frees us for it. It establishes the world as it transforms it. One of the adaptations that Coleman makes with her theology in regard to Cobb's description of creative transformation and its focus on Christ, she argues for the need to emphasize the creative power of transformation rather than the specific experience of Christ, especially in Christ's typical association with Jesus. The creative participates in the profane work of attending to what is always coming, and to be surprised and amazed in this encounter with what the creating and being creative, what is coming and becoming is showing us. Coleman also emphasizes that creative transformation, in addition to challenging the violent status quo that threatens life in different contexts, is a work of creaturely agency in partnership with divine agency that takes place in contexts of community. That is, salvation as understood through creative transformation does not come from an individual figure who comes from outside the community, but in practice that take place within communities whose practices widen the participation in life beyond past understandings. This is a perspective that I hope to explore regarding messianic shame. By turning to shame as a participant in creative transformation, I think there may be a chance to recognize the unknowability and impossibility to fully know ourselves and others, but also to find ways to accept and love ourselves and others anyway, in whatever form we come, and also to learn how to be amazed and surprised by it and delight in love. There can be in shame the impotentiality for new possibilities, new opportunities for identities in the world, based not in violence but in love. By bearing witness to our shame and in shame, with all our impossibilities and possibilities, there can be a breath of space to pause to decide where to direct our attention in love, and also a chance to stop and rest in love itself, in creative amazement and wonder at what is always being created in relationships that are coming and becoming. Thank you.
Our third speaker is Andrew Doss, who is an attorney and writer whose work explores how process metaphysics might inform the changing shapes of international governance to address the 21st century's significant challenges. He has degrees from Georgetown University, Leiden University in The Hague, and Yale University. He recently served as the director of the Governor's Resilient Commission in the state of Louisiana. His paper title is The End of Sovereignty and the Hope of Process Models in International Governance Structures.
We want agency. He did not begin to hear it all at once. The protagonist of William Faulkner's Old Man remembers of the great Mississippi River flood of 1927. He suddenly became aware that he had been hearing it all the time, a sound so much beyond all his experience that up to this point he had been as oblivious of it as an ant or a flea might be of the sound of the avalanche on which it rides. The whole world is in the throes of a paradigm shift of understanding the agency of the human body in the cosmos. And Stephanie, the more than human body as well. It is a question that involves the pain of a history of violence, supremacy, dominated and dominating. For millennia of Western documented human history, humans have had a static, fixed cosmology in which bodies of all sorts are understood as sovereign, impermeably separate, bifurcated, subjects and objects bouncing off of each other like billiard balls, competing for leverage as subject, and lorded over by the ultimate subject of an impassable, immovable divine power. I label this here as a sovereignty-based framework, using the word sovereignty to indicate independence, autonomy, self-contained spheres of control. Suddenly, we are coming to a new understanding and experience of the human body in the cosmos. Moving through the ideas of Darwin, process, relativity, quantum, string theory, entanglement, liberation, feminist, black and queer theologies, and concrete participation across fields such as technology, the environment, economics, our actual daily experience is newly one of deep, even overwhelming interconnectedness. A butterfly flaps its wings in China and a storm rages in New York may have been a thoughtful analogy for my dad's baby boomer generation, but for young people now, it is daily concrete reality. Perhaps a bat flaps its wings in China and a pandemic rages in New York. Our bodies are not only conceived of, but increasingly experienced as co-participatory, dynamic occasions deeply entwined of each other, the universe and God, making incarnate an ongoing process of ultimate creativity. This runs all the way up and down and requires the adaptation and invention of new models of living. A question we must answer in our age is how we find agency in such dynamic interconnectedness. We need a constructive vision. Globalization's watershed changes have left us feeling a lack of agency over not only our world at large, but our individual lives and our place in the lives of our communities. In the face of the digital revolution, pandemics, escalating socio-political tension due to increasing inequality, and the climate crisis, to name but a few, our future feels out of our control. Somewhere out there, forces beyond us, powers and principalities, direct our daily lives without clear definition, let alone accountability to us. We feel non-efficacious and without belonging. It is scary as hell. This feared and experienced lack of agency underlies the cultural and socio-political movement across the globe, improperly labeled as populism. Brexit in England, Trump in the United States, Duterte in the Philippines, Bolsonaro in Brazil, Modi in India, Meloni in Italy, and on, all elected by citizens in drawing against this paradigm shift, captured by rhetoric and reactionary policy that promises autonomy, localized control domestically, and nationalism globally. In short, agency. Specifically, a return to a nostalgic myth of agency within a sovereignty-based framework. Sovereignty was the word that Brexit promised to restore to take control back from EU imposition. Sovereignty was the cry and legal justification of Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro to reject international efforts to stop his burning of the Amazon. Conservative author John Fonte defended Trump's obsessive use of the word sovereignty in each of his speeches before the UN, writing, "It all comes down to two words: who decides?" In other words, who has agency? So, quick survey. How many of you see, don't raise your hands, how many of you see beauty and reality and potential in process and are ready to compost the sovereignty-based framework? Okay. How many of you want to shed national sovereignty, which has been the basis of our international system since at least the 1648 Treaty of Westphalia? Okay. If you're serious about that, how many of you want to shed the United States Bill of Rights, women's health rights, indigenous and tribal rights, and our international human rights system altogether? all of which are based on body sovereignty. I meant it when I said this paradigm shift is scary as hell. What's going on is not merely a political realignment or a pendulum swing. It is not just progressive. This is a reformation of human society, perhaps unprecedented in history. The paradigm shift is bigger than any particular policy or party and can't be undone. Part of the very problem is that our old structures of thought and institutions are obsolete to address today's realities. Specifically, sovereignty-based systems are structurally incapable of addressing the trans-sovereign complexity of the biggest challenges we face, especially the climate crisis. Re-entrenching ourselves within obsolete structures will only make our pain worse. Instead, we need to deconstruct them and innovate new constructive structures. But to do so, we need a new story of the human body's agency, individually and collectively, within a process framework. To understand what governance is, first we need to know what it is to be a human body at all. In this paradigm shift, we in the West are transitioning from an understanding of the self as a sovereign, hermetically sealed container, toward a self that is an incarnate relation, perhaps analogous to a semiconductor. I haven't written a paper in the last 7 years without quoting Catherine Keller, and I'm not going to miss the chance now that she's in the room. Dr. Keller elucidates, I am the complex unity of feeling that rises up at this moment in response to my feelings of the plural world. Everything in some sense is really part of me, however dimly felt. Every actual entity is present in every other actual entity. I cannot exist without in some sense taking part in you, in the child I once was, in the breeze stirring the down on my arm, in the child starving far away, in the flashing round of the spiral nebula. And inasmuch as I feel what I take account of, I may own it. I make the world my own world and so create myself. This is not abstract. As a concrete example, while prior generations understood that the inside of the human body was walled off from the outside world, microbiology teaches today that the human stomach alone has 10 times as much external bacteria in it as human cells. So even our actual bodies are made up of more that is not us than that which is. And without that bacteria, there would be no person. Stephanie yesterday taught me that viral DNA is even encoded in our DNA. From another perspective, did you know that what makes us human is that we music with a CK? Evolutionary biologists have learned that what distinguished humans from other intelligent animals is that our brains and nervous systems developed by socially observing that an action has an outcome, which can be mirrored to eventually build something. An ape can pick up a stick and throw it, but its brain is incapable of target practice. We, on the other hand, observe, mirror, and build. Our ancestors' first social gatherings, even before language, were banging stones to manufacture basic tools together. Uga hits a rock and it sharpens. Tunk, observing Uga, mirrors and builds upon that, and his rock sharpens. Now Uga, observing Tunk's action, mirrors and builds upon that, and her rock is sharper. And on, back and forth, observe, mirror, build, a rhythm, a syncopation. Evolutionary biologist Gary Tomlinson says that it was this literal rock music that shaped our brains. He calls this process musicking. It is social before individual, physical before cognitive. It is how we evolved to build tools. Eventually, we observed that grunts and primal sounds could have outcomes. We mirrored them, and even before we learned to speak, we found ourselves singing. This rhythm became our center in the natural universe, and this is the way that we are in relation with one another. The rhythm of walking, of holding hands, of language, a syncopation, a habituation, a formative ritual, observe, mirror, build, observe, mirror, build. Rhythm, ritual, liturgy. The mimetic musicking process doesn't just entrain our lives in immediate community and environment, but across time. According to Tomlinson, 1 million years ago, our brains developed the capacity to socially transmit learning across generations. He writes, musicking is implicated deeply in thinking at a distance. It developed alongside a release from proximity, whereby humans gradually gained the capacity to imagine things not present to the senses, ultimately leading to a poiesis, the process of bringing into presence something not present, an anticipated future. Perhaps, while sovereignty-based agency is limited to static, physical, or geographic proximity, this relationally anticipated future can be an essential element of process agency, the capacity to deliberately move across time into an imagined relational future. Our whole life, every interaction, conscious and unconscious, is engaged in this musicking rhythm. It is literally who we are, an incarnate process of constant mutual formation. James K.A. Smith examines how our collective formation, this musicking writ large, takes place in the daily habits, patterns, and rituals of broader society, what he calls cultural liturgies. He posits that these cultural liturgies are a form of worship understood in the fullness of the term. In practicing these often invisible and even automaticized cultural liturgies, we become what we worship. If we design our lives to worship sovereignty, we form ourselves as sovereign individuals. If we worship relational process, we form ourselves as relations. Governance, or public decision-making, is a cultural liturgy of formation, of musicking as a society. Bruce Jennings defines it as the overall process of coordinating, shaping, and directing individual and collective agency. At the global political level, the paradigm shift from a sovereignty to a process framework has dissolved traditionally defined divisions into an entirely unprecedented system of relationality called radical connectivity. The technological revolution, the interweaving of economies, the climate crisis, the breakdown of traditional institutions has splayed open every preconceived sphere of sovereignty. Geographic borders are increasingly experienced as legal constructions that don't align with our operating realities. Local and global are increasingly difficult to demarcate. Our belief in stomach walls and national walls are equally dissolving. In his book, The End of Big, Nico Mealy writes that one thing is certain: radical connectivity is toxic to conventional power structures. Today, before our eyes, the top-down nation-state model as we have known it is collapsing. Traditional sources of information like broadcast and print media are in decline. Aircraft carriers and other military hardware that for decades underpinned geopolitical power are obsolete and highly vulnerable, while organized violence remains a growing threat. Competitive hierarchies within industries are disappearing, traditional cultural authorities are fading. Everything we depend on to preserve both social stability and cherish values, including the rule of law and civil liberties, is coming unraveled. I want to pause to remind you of a few words to parallel what is happening in patterns of globalization and patterns of process thought. Sovereignty framework. Self-contained, separate, static, independent, freedom from imposition. The currency is power held and possessed in competition. The ideal is being a king or a queen, a sovereign authority in control. Process framework. Dynamic, co-participatory, relation, freedom in belonging. The currency is connectivity. The ideal is being an effective semiconductor, a hub that organizes and directs the flow of relations. Global strategic thinker Parag Khanna doesn't realize that he is understating the paradigm shift when he writes, "We are living through a change in change. Not merely a shift in structure from one superpower to multiple, but a far deeper one from a state-based order to a multi-actor system. Structural change happens every few decades. Systems change only every few centuries. Structural change makes the world complicated. Systems change makes it complex. International relations among states are complicated, while today's global network civilization is complex. Connectivity is the main cause of this complexity. New global macro patterns have emerged in the last decade that may be analogous to something like social concrescence. To name 4. 1, governance functions traditionally performed by government are now being carried out by a pluralism of entities, including government, intergovernmental organizations, IGOs, non-governmental organizations, NGOs, market agents, such as multinational corporations, microfinanciers, social entrepreneurs, and hybrid bodies, such as healthcare systems and universities. 2, successful governments act more as economic connectors than economic providers, connecting their constituents to resources with other governance actors in new partnerships across sector and geography. 3, with increasingly transparent interconnectedness across the globe, the success of any particular geographic community is based on how well it fulfills a dual mandate to serve both the citizens within its geographic boundaries and the citizens outside of them. 4, a complex pattern of 2 seemingly contradictory forces is operating in aggregation and devolution. Aggregation is the term used to describe universal interconnectedness across boundaries of all sorts, geographical, national, and cultural. Global oneness. Groups sharing important commonalities form a connection to one another and are prepared to take action together, despite distances and various forms of separation. Connectivity aggregates to share the mutual benefits of infrastructure, economic integration, labor migration, and political reconciliation between would-be competitors that helps maintain peace. Devolution, on the other hand, is a localizing movement, a desire for decentralization and for authority to be granted to smaller concentrations of communities, formed by geographical locale and by a common identity. This is part of why cities are becoming more economically important than nation states. Kana writes that in addition to the traditional forces of anti-colonialism and ethnic grievance, the newer realities of weak and overpopulated states, struggles to control natural resources, accelerated economic competition, and even the rise of big data and climate change all point to more devolution in the future rather than less. As Tom's Texas energy independence disaster example set up, I'll note that the Western left has a prejudice to privilege devolution or localism, which denigrates the value and unstoppable reality of aggregation. This prejudice is itself another effort to return to a sovereignty framework of local autonomy and control that ignores the larger body, like deciding that the entire health of the hand depends on the forefinger alone. A forefinger's particular agency is discovered in its dynamic relation to thumb and other fingers and palm, its oneness in the hand. So too is the fascinating current cooperative global pattern of aggregation and devolution. So too is a process agency of Whiteheadian social concrescence. So just descriptively, not evaluatively, connectivity, pluralistic actors, the concrescence of the global in shared authority, mutual interdependence, a release from proximity. The world is in chaos and we might not make it, but is this not a move toward a process framework? Can we name that as the hope and more deliberately design and push ourselves and our systems into process models? There are exciting innovations in international governance that we don't have time to explore now, but I'll name briefly. Herman Green's Earth Law Center leads an exciting emerging legal field of practice. Other structural inventions include DAOs, DAOs, decentralized autonomous organizations, teal organizational models, public policy making centered on the ritual of eating together, and global network infrastructures in which members of local decision-making councils sit with equal voting power on councils in sister communities around the world. I will note, though, that all of these innovations are emergent in a wide open field of potential, but not yet actualization or practice. We don't know what will work. In conclusion, we ain't there yet. The good news is that the populist cry to return to the nostalgic myth of sovereignty-based agency is a death cry, a reaction and perhaps last gasp against the multi-millennia paradigm shift in the middle of which we find ourselves. The process framework is winning, and it carries the potential of a vision of justice and mutual interdependence. The bad news is that we might not survive it. Our sovereignty-based systems remain structurally incapable of addressing the trans-sovereign complexity of the biggest challenges we face, especially the climate crisis. But if we do survive, it will be because we are able to not only work out and tell a new constructive story of the human body's agency in a process cosmos, but to design process-based governance structures which can coordinate, shape, and direct, or observe, mirror, and build, or music that agency to the poesis of the anticipated future we desire. In the rush of the flood, Faulkner's protagonist quit yelling then and went back to paddling. He was not trying to outrun it. He just knew from experience that when it overtook him, he would have to travel in the same direction it was moving in anyway, whether he wanted to or not. And when it did overtake him, he would begin to move too fast to stop, no matter what places he might come to.
Thanks so much to all three of our speakers. I learned a great deal from all three papers. What I'd like to do is ask each of you to choose among three questions that I have so that nobody be blindsided. I hope at least one of the three that I ask each of you will be to your liking. And if you could speak for a minute or two and then leave some time for questions from the audience. So Stephanie, first, I wonder if you choose this of the options, I wonder if you could talk about the place of critical theory within your own overall view. So some people want to say that critical theory is the only rigorous method, okay? And I take it you do not agree with that, nor would Whitehead. So in Whitehead's Aims of Education, just to cite one example, he talks about learning in terms of three stages: romance, where you get interested in an idea and are excited about something; secondly, precision or critique, where you develop the critical skills necessary to deal with the subject matter in question; and then thirdly, generalization, where you take the results of romance and precision and place them within a larger whole, which for Whitehead involved metaphysics and cosmology. I don't know if you want to go that route, but I would like to ask about the wider frame that you have in mind, which enables you to say something negative about critical theory. The second option, I take it that the problem that you see with critical theory is that it leaves the bifurcation of nature intact. And that's a problem both, I'm alleging this is your view, so correct me if I'm misinterpreting you. And that's a problem both because it underplays subhuman agency and then overplays human agency. So I'd like to ask about how you would articulate this notion that critical theory underplays subhuman agency. Now, process thinkers have doctrines like panpsychism or panexperientialism that they would use to articulate that, or maybe biosemiotic theory, or maybe a theory of animal rights. But I'd like you to talk a little bit more, if this is the option you choose, about this underplaying of subhuman agency. And I'd also like to ask about whether or not you would agree that there's an underplaying of subhuman patiency status. So process thinkers like Whitehead and Hartshorne like to go back to Plato's notion and the sophist that any being, anything that exists because it has the power to affect others and to be affected by others. And if you think of the topic of animal rights, moral patiency status looms larger there than the issue of moral agency status. Okay. And then the third issue concerns the section in your paper which you did not have a chance to read, which I really liked, where you talk about Carolyn Merchant and the death of nature. So, and this is a big theme in Whitehead too, right? That mechanism was a disaster, and Whitehead urges us to, switch to an organic view of nature. And this seems to be related to a switch in a conception of power. So as a political scientist, you might be willing to talk about power, okay? Specifically, Whitehead's distinction between coercive power on the one hand and then persuasive power on the other. So I wonder if you could pick one of those three and talk for a minute or two.
Well, thank you very much for your thoughtful comments and questions, and for the generous gesture to give us a choice of question. Unfortunately, I want to answer all of your excellent questions. But if I'm going to speak for just a minute or two, maybe the best place to go is to talk about, is to respond to your first question, which is what is the place of critical theory within my own overall approach? And as I tried to sort of set out at the outset, I think that critical theory is we can't do without it, right? It sort of enables us to conduct certain kinds of investigations, but I think, as a political theorist, critical theory also generates certain kinds of political affects that really are energizing and they're mobilizing, and I think we can't, right? We can't let those go. So it's a powerful source of energetic affect, which you need to get certain kinds of movements and transformations underway and to keep them going, right? So from an affective perspective, I think, if for no other reason, we can't do without critical theory. But some of the language I used in my presentation I took or borrowed from Rita Felsky, whose book The Limits of Critique describes something she calls critical exceptionalism, which is her term to name a sort of a trend of treating critique, and she's a literary theorist, but the same can be said for political theory, which is critique becomes the only way to do scholarship rightly and righteously. And so she goes and looks at certain limits to this way of thinking about critique, and I'm interested by Felsky's approach. She talks about the importance of affect and attachment, and positive affect and attachment, and not just the sort of affect of distance and skepticism and suspicion. And I like what she's doing, but I think that we can pay even closer attention to another type of affect, which is more material, and that's when we look at the ways that our bodies and our thinking are interrupted, inflected, shaped by these non-human forces, right? So climatic forces, and that way of thinking you really can't get with critique because, and I'm trying in earnest to find critical theoretical traditions to engage with and sort of in a constructive way, but it does seem to be quite difficult to bring in affirmative attention to the capacity of affect to bring about positive transformation, and I mean affect in that material sense. Thank you.
Thanks so much. So Yuki, the first option I'd like to give you is to talk a little bit about the relationship between your view of shame and the concept of original sin. I'm not a theologian or a religious studies person, but I couldn't help but think of original sin because there are certain things that I have done, certain sins I may have committed for which I would feel guilty. For example, if I lied, cheated, or engaged in electoral fraud, okay? Some people might accuse me of doing that. Guilt seems appropriate there, right? But you want to distinguish shame from guilt. And that struck me as analogous to the difference between the normal old sins like lying and cheating and electoral fraud on the one hand, and then original sin, which is not due to anything that it wasn't any misdeed on my part that would, prop up the concept of original sin. And no doubt the notion of original sin has been overemphasized in certain aspects of the Christian tradition, right? But anyhow, I was just wondering what the relationship is between sin and original sin and shame. Secondly, another option would be to have you talk about your post-liberal, I don't think you use that phrase, but post-Western democracy view. I can see why some people would have criticisms of political liberalism, say, due to what Rawls calls the curse of money on politics. There are sort of familiar problems there. But I noticed that you do use the word rights in your talk, and I was thinking of some possible positive things associated with political liberalism that might endure in some sort of post-Western democracy view, and I'd like to ask about that, like concept of rights, freedom of speech, separation of powers, and so on. Whitehead and Hartzell themselves were political liberals, but clearly not laissez-faire neoliberals. So I know in everyday discourse, some people sort of push those two together, but they're quite different. So if you might want to talk a little bit about what your post-Western democracy view would due to some of the best features of political liberalism. And then thirdly, you might want to talk or help me understand how shame could play a role in creative transformation. Whenever I have experienced what you call shame, I tend to be paralyzed by it. And it's not a dynamic thing that leads to creative transformation, but you have a sense that it does. Now, this distinction that you make between chronos and kairos, I found very helpful. But if you could help me understand a little bit better the link you want to draw between shame on the one hand and then creative transformation on the other. So I wonder if you could pick one of those three and go with it.
I'm trying to pick the easy one.
Okay.
And I don't know that that's possible. So I'm gonna answer that last one, and I may get into the others as well, because I find them to be very related. So I will begin with a sense of shame of my own about my use of creative transformation, in that this is, and I stated before, this is beginning work for me. And I turned to it, and it was, for me, it felt like a very happy, think effectively, happenstance, because I was drawn to Giorgio Agamben's understanding of shame because it was so different from what I've received from the common understanding that it proliferates in Western society, which is shame is an affect of it's violent, it's toxic, it is not associated with the best of humanity. And yet it's not assumed that by every culture in the world. And so my investigation has really been looking at how have we received this understanding about shame, and in what ways was that formed? And through the investigations that I've done, I look at the ways in which original Western writings around shame took place in relationship with colonialisms and legitimating colonialisms and the violence of colonialisms, of Western colonialism. And so it made me wonder if shame is really is an affect that we feel, is it necessarily always bad? Is it necessarily always paralyzing or frightening, or is there a utility or something that is meant to be learned in that moment of passivity and that shock? And there's a wonderful, I think it's a wonderful book anyway. There's a shame theorist or a sociologist named Helen Merrill Lind who wrote a book in the 50s called On Shame and the Search for Identity. And she takes this very different tack from books that were written at the time about shame, where she talks about the ways in which shame is related to an exposure of the self, but also the world. Where we uncover understandings about ourselves that we didn't know, and very similar to what Agamben is saying about the self being confronted with the self, and that causes this stopping. And I think it's very important to distinguish between the violence of shame as it has been taken up by governmental or social powers in order to silence or destroy. I mean, if you look at who receives the brunt of shame, they are usually the ones who are deemed most inhuman or most killable, I mean, to use Agamben's framework. And so for me, as somebody who is not part of that group, the question for me is, in being exposed to this, in this relationship of violence that I'm protected from somehow, or that I could be a part of except for different happenstances or strategies of social or political belonging, I feel shame at knowing this, but is there something in that calls me into some responsibility or some accountability and helps me understand that the world that I have received is not the world that must be? Mm-hmm. And so shame becomes this reorientation of ontology, of political structure, of the cosmos for me, mm-hmm. Getting back to original sin, mm-hmm. Poor Augustine. What I found in creative transformation, creative transformation does not feel good. Mm-hmm. It is not necessarily a great thing, but it is that recognition that the world is dynamic and changing, and that we have accountabilities and responsibilities and solidarities in the changing and the dynamic processes. And so the problem with this approach is how I don't have any pragmatic answers. But then again, I think that what I've learned from this investigation is it's so common, especially in it's so common in the systems, structures that we've inherited to think I must do something, when maybe it's not that I must do something, but we must do something. And each thing that we do contributes together toward the change, and we don't know where it's going to go. And that's the problem, but also the possibility.
Got it. Yeah, thanks. Very helpful. Andrew, one thing that struck me in the written version of your paper, and it was sort of there in your oral presentation, was this phrase, the death of sovereignty. And I was wondering why you would want to defend the death of sovereignty as opposed to the transformation of sovereignty. So there's all kinds of negative things associated with sovereignty as you describe it, or autonomy as well, some negative things associated with sovereignty or autonomy. But I wonder if there aren't some positive things too. For example, in the context of the abortion debate, the locution, my body, seems quite appropriate. And I think we could imagine examples in the international realm too that involve the Ukraine. You know, that sovereignty and autonomy need to be rethought, but I'm just wondering about that phrase, the death of sovereignty or the death of autonomy. Secondly, in your paper you talk about how the separateness associated with traditional autonomy or traditional sovereignty leads to violence. And so the second option would be a chance for you to consider, or I would ask how you would respond to the observation that absorption in the whole can also be an incentive to violence. So right and left-wing totalitarianisms in the 20th century had an organic view of the state. And the first thing they tried to do was convince people that you should not think of yourself as autonomous individuals, but as, you know, part of Mother Russia or the fatherland or whatever. In other words, isn't violence really complex? And then maybe whatever you're going to say about the origins of violence is going to have to involve several considerations. And then thirdly, in your notes, I picked this one because I just wanted to show that I read these papers carefully, and I even read the dense notes. You denigrate social contract theory with the aid of Durkheim. And I was thinking of Charles Mills, who makes a distinction between historical versions of social contract theory and then normative or hypothetical versions of social contract theory, as you find in Rawls. And the former, Mills legitimately sees as problematic. But might there still be some life left in social contract theory as a normative, hypothetical device to have us all think together what a just society would look like, either at the national or international levels? So let me stop there and have you pick one of those and chat about it for a minute or two.
Thank you. Yeah, I'll just start with the third one. The issue with social contract theories is very simply that it starts with a default of an asocial order, which then decides to become social. Subjects enter into relationship, but the default is that they're actually independent. And so I do think that is our modern international governance system. That's why the word international, because we are first nations and then we interact. I think that's just, I think Whitehead describes something very different, which is not just a oneness, but it's this concrescence, it's this constant becoming, which everybody else here can speak to much more articulately than me. But I do think that that going back to your second question as well, that there's a violence in misunderstanding it to either direction. If you lose the particularity of a human being, of a human body, if you lose that precious particularity and just absorb it into a oneness, then that is violence. And if you create a system in which, or a framework in which you have sovereign subjects trying to lord power over objects, or making objects of other people, then you're also in the realm of violence. So I think my hope of this is that the Whiteheadian vision does offer something which is which is different than violence, which is creative. Yeah, and I think that's literally the question that we have to sort through in a way that I haven't found an answer to yet. Is what agency looks like if it's not either of those extremes.
Thanks. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Wonderful panel. We have time for one short question, and I see Matt first, so he gets the prize.
Thanks, Andrew. Thanks very much to all of you. My question's for Stephanie about Bruno Latour, the late, great Bruno Latour. So on the one hand, he really wants to welcome in the non-human world into what we call our political negotiations and associations, and he's developed this idea of the Parliament of Things. I wonder what you think about that, its viability, potential pitfalls or issues with it. But on the other hand, Latour, in Facing Gaia and in, I think it was an LA Review of Books article about visiting with James Lovelock, he mentions one of Lovelock's friends who got him in touch, the ecologist Stephen Harding, who teaches at Schumacher College and has written a book called Animate Earth, and he's kind of more of a panpsychist, animistic, New Age adjacent maybe, and Latour was very critical and was critical in many places about not wanting to think of Gaia as a goddess. And so he wants to welcome in the non-human world, but he's distancing himself from these sorts of earth spiritualities. He's friends with witches like Isabel Stenger, so he's clearly willing to be in dialogue, but what's your sense of this tension in his thought?
That's such an interesting question, and I haven't actually thought about it in those terms, so I don't think I'm going to be able to give a very satisfactory answer, but I'll try. Maybe a place to start is with what I remember as being the first question you asked, which is what utility or what might be the value of some of his work in sort of assembling Parliament of Things, or the alternative to the sort of alternative COP that he staged. And I mean, I think on the one hand, the value is limitless, if for no other reason than the force of the dramatization that was brought into play in the staging of this Parliament of Things, where you have representatives not only of nations, of human nations, but of all kinds of constituencies, right? So sort of non-human constituencies have a spot at the table, have a say in decision making. The images alone are, right, sort of priceless. I think at the same time, there are certain limitations to that approach. It still retains a certain kind of image of representation, which I think maybe does not adequately give us a sense of entanglement, still retains a sort of sense of separateness, and raises interesting questions about possibilities for communication across barriers of language. But I mean, I wouldn't, I'm not interested in criticizing it. I think it's a great source of inspiration and has enabled people to do all sorts of things. A project I'm involved in Copenhagen right now, we held an experiment, a sort of experimental workshop in more than human politics, and we found inspiration in the work that Latour has done. As to your question regarding this tension in Latour, again, I haven't really given it much thought. I mean, I know he has this, I think it was with Tim Lenton, a piece on Gaia and why Gaia is not, well, I can't remember the title, maybe why Gaia is not God or why Gaia is not one or something to this effect. So perhaps the tension you're pointing to is between bringing in more of the non-human, but not wanting to sort of fall into a happy organicism. And in that case, the first thing that comes to mind is Lynn Margulis, who calls, I don't know if I can say this in here. Okay, so I won't say. She calls Gaia one tough something. So to give a sense both of the power, but also that power is not always good or happy. And so maybe that's one way of talking about the tension in Latour. But I love the question, and I'll think more about it. Thank you.
Let's give them a hand, everybody. Excellent work. Thank you. All right, we enter lunchtime. Hope you enjoy. We're going to be back here at 2 o'clock promptly.
Great.
for process philosophy and education. See you all soon.
Of course, I thought of all the things I really wanted to say.
Can you send me a copy of your dissertation? I really want to read it.
Oh, my gosh. Yes.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, sure.
It's
I
all
really
broken.
appreciate it.
Yeah.
All right. Did the timing mainly.
My friend who
Oh, good,
loves
I was
that.
coherent. Okay, I was
Oh, very cool.
Read for years and now I'm going to.
Yeah, really
It's
tracked very cleanly.
Oh, good, because it's like you read,
we just had an
you
event
deal with it
at-
for so
at
long, and then
Copenhagen,
you start
40
just
years
going,
since
am I the
Death of
only one who
Nature.
understands this?
So that's why I was
Yeah.
I agree. It's really good. And the resonances of Whitehead, especially in science in the modern world, are quite staggering.
The whole mess of it to you, it is a messy dissertation.
I love that. Thank you.
But yes,
I want to dig into it, so however I can.
I really love what you did with sovereignty, that questioning, and especially the, do you want to get rid of all of this? Because of that argument between like Native American and indigenous sovereignty is part of how they're able to exist and protect themselves. So,
I tried.
The author's name is Rita.
I would like your whole paper.
Well, when I get it done.
Okay.
F like Frank. S like Sam. Here, let me write it for you.
It's difficult, yeah. I kept when I okay, fine. Great, thank you very much. Nobody has a right to transition my body here. It strikes me that the appeal to sovereignty for getting to the other side. Really strong. What is the goal of agency? And the same thing with nations decisions. This is ours.
I do think that literally unless we just
I think we are individuals. I mean, it's like, I don't think this is our only avenue. I guess I was trying to say the agency is just as important as
redesign within our government structures. And if we can do that, if we can do public decision making differently. Because right now we're working uphill and these incentives that are forcing